I built my life brick by brick, clawed my way to success, bought my dream $2 million mountain villa with money my mother left me. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my peace, mine alone. But when I drove up that winding road after months of exhausting work, desperate for silence and solitude, I saw 2 cars in my driveway that made my blood turn to ice: my husband's black Mercedes and my sister's white Lexus. They weren't supposed to be there. Nobody was. I stepped out of my car, and that's when I saw it: a man's shirt draped over the porch railing, a woman's scarf catching the mountain breeze, the front door slightly open. My hands started shaking, but I didn't storm inside screaming. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every wine glass, every piece of evidence, every detail. Then she appeared, my own sister, wearing my silk robe, smirking like she'd already won. "You're getting old, sis," she said, looking me up and down with pure contempt. "You really can't expect to keep a man satisfied anymore." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I made one phone call to my lawyer. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I'm not the type of woman who breaks. I'm the type who plans. And what I was about to uncover wasn't just an affair. It was a conspiracy, a criminal operation, and they'd chosen the wrong woman to betray. By the time I was done, my sister would be on her knees, and the mountain would witness the kind of justice that echoes. My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm 52 years old, and for the past 27 years I've built a career in commercial real estate that most people only dream about. I started as a receptionist at a failing firm in Denver and clawed my way up to senior partner, closing deals that transformed skylines and made millionaires out of investors who'd bet on my vision. The highway curved upward, leaving the smog of the city behind, as my Range Rover climbed into the Colorado Rockies. With each mile of elevation, I felt the weight of the past 6 months lifting from my shoulders. 6 months of 18-hour days, contentious negotiations, and a $340 million mixed-use development deal that had finally mercifully closed 3 days ago. My neck ached from tension I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. The executive team had insisted on a celebration dinner, champagne toasts, and talk of the next big project, but all I could think about was silence, mountain air, my villa. I'd told everyone I was taking 2 weeks off, unprecedented for me, the woman who checked emails during Christmas dinner and took client calls from hospital waiting rooms. My husband David said he'd join me on Sunday. My assistant knew not to call unless the building was literally on fire. For the next 48 hours I would be completely blissfully alone. The aspen trees lining the mountain road had turned that impossible gold that only happens in late September, their leaves shimmering like coins in the afternoon light. I cracked the window and breathed in the pine-scented air, felt the temperature drop 10 degrees as I climbed higher. This was what I'd been dreaming about during those endless conference calls and contract reviews, this exact moment of transition from the person everyone needed me to be to simply myself. The villa had been my dream long before it became real. 5 years ago, when my mother passed away after a brief, brutal fight with cancer, she left me $1.8 million with a handwritten note tucked into her will. "For a place of peace, Catherine. Every woman needs somewhere that's entirely her own." Mom had spent her whole life in apartments and rental houses, married to my father, who moved them every few years, chasing promotions that never quite materialized. She'd never had permanence, never had a space she could truly call hers. When I was 14, crying over yet another move that would take me away from friends I'd just made, she'd squeezed my hand and said, "Someday you'll build roots so deep nothing can move you." So I'd bought this land, 12 acres at 9,200 feet, with views that stretched 50 miles on clear days. I'd hired an architect who understood that I didn't want a showpiece. I wanted a sanctuary. Together, we designed something that felt like it grew from the mountain itself. Native stone and timber floor-to-ceiling windows facing south and west, a great room with a fireplace you could stand inside, and a master suite with a soaking tub positioned so you could watch the sunset while the day's tension dissolved into lavender-scented water. Every detail had been my choice. The slate tiles in the entryway cool and smooth underfoot. The custom bookcases built to hold my collection of first editions. The kitchen with professional-grade appliances because I'd discovered I actually enjoyed cooking when I wasn't doing it under time pressure. The deck that wrapped around 3 sides of the house with furniture I'd chosen for comfort, rather than style, deep cushions, sturdy construction places to curl up with a book or a glass of wine, or nothing but your own thoughts. I'd bought and built this place a full year before I even met David. It was mine in a way nothing else in my life was mine, not connected to my career, not shared with anyone, just purely and completely Catherine's space. I'd put it in an irrevocable trust on my lawyer's advice, something about estate planning and asset protection that had seemed paranoid at the time, but that Margaret had insisted was simply smart practice. The final turn brought me to the gate, 8 feet of wrought iron with a keypad I'd had installed for security. I punched in the code and the gate swung open smoothly. The driveway curved through a stand of lodgepole pines, and then the house came into view, all warm wood and glinting glass, exactly as beautiful as I remembered. Except something was wrong. My hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard I heard the leather creak. 2 cars sat in my driveway, parked like they belonged there, like they had every right to be there. David's black Mercedes S-Class, the one he was absurdly proud of with its custom interior and license plate that read DWLSH1. And beside it, my younger sister Jennifer's white Lexus, the RX model she'd bought last year and hadn't stopped posting about on social media. My heart started pounding in that sick, heavy way that comes before you fully understand why you're afraid. They weren't supposed to be here. David had said he was meeting clients in Denver until Sunday. Jennifer lived 4 hours away in Boulder, and never visited without calling first, usually asking to borrow money or complaining about her latest failed relationship or job. I sat in my idling car, staring at those 2 vehicles, my mind spinning through innocent explanations. Maybe David had finished early and wanted to surprise me. Maybe he'd invited Jennifer to join us for the weekend, some misguided attempt at family bonding. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why they were here in my sanctuary when I'd been promised solitude. But even as I tried to convince myself, I noticed other things. The front door, usually closed and locked, stood slightly ajar, just a few inches, but enough to see the darkness of the interior beyond. And there, draped over the porch railing like it had been tossed carelessly aside, was a man's dress shirt. Blue. The same shade David had worn to the office last week. I killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the pines. My hands were shaking now, that full-body tremor that comes when your instincts are screaming danger, but your conscious mind hasn't caught up yet. On the porch, partially hidden by the railing, I could see something else, a woman's scarf, pale pink silk, the expensive kind. It caught the breeze and fluttered almost playful, obscenely cheerful in the afternoon light. I knew that scarf. I'd been with Jennifer when she bought it at Nordstrom, had watched her deliberate for 20 minutes over whether to spend $200 on something so impractical. She'd used the credit card I'd given her for emergencies, the one I was supposed to cancel but never had because she was my sister, and I kept hoping she'd eventually get her life together. The afternoon sun illuminated every detail with crystalline clarity, the scattered clothing, the open door, the 2 cars that shouldn't be there. And somewhere in my chest, something that had been holding together for 52 years began to crack. I hadn't opened the door yet, but their clothes already told the story I didn't want to read. I pulled my phone from my purse with hands that had gone eerily steady. The shaking had stopped the moment I understood what I was looking at. It was like something had clicked off inside me, the part that felt, that reacted emotionally, and been replaced by the cold, analytical mind I used to negotiate million-dollar deals. I'd learned long ago that emotion was a liability in business. Apparently, it was also a liability in betrayal. I opened my camera app and started with the driveway. 2 vehicles photographed from multiple angles with the timestamp visible in the corner, 3:47 p.m. September 24th. David's Mercedes with its vanity plate. Jennifer's Lexus parked so close to his car their mirrors nearly touched. I zoomed in on the license plates, clear and indisputable. Then I walked up the porch steps, my footfalls deliberately quiet on the wood I'd chosen for its rich color and durability. The man's shirt on the railing photograph. The pink scarf tangled in the deck furniture photograph. The front door standing open like an invitation photograph. Through the doorway, I could see into my great room, and what I saw made my stomach clench, but my hands remained absolutely steady. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me first. Wine. Perfume. Something else. Something intimate that didn't belong in my space. 2 wine glasses sat on the coffee table, both half full of red wine that had probably cost $50 a bottle from my personal collection in the kitchen. One glass had a lipstick mark, not my shade, but I recognized it. Jennifer's signature coral pink, the color she wore because some beauty magazine had told her it made her look younger. The other glass had no lipstick, just fingerprints, and the ghost of David's mouth on the rim. I photographed the glasses. Then the candles, 3 of them vanilla-scented votives from the guest bathroom, still burning wax, pooled and nearly spent. They'd been burning for hours. The throw blanket I kept folded on the back of the couch now lay crumpled on the floor beside the coffee table. My throat tightened, but I swallowed it down and took the picture. In the kitchen, Jennifer's purse sat on the marble counter, that ridiculous Gucci bag she'd bought with money she didn't have, probably on a credit card she couldn't pay off. I'd seen it enough times when she'd come begging for loans she never intended to repay. I photographed it next to my KitchenAid mixer, the juxtaposition almost absurd. David's sport coat was draped over the dining chair at the head of the table. My chair, the one I sat in when I ate breakfast watching the sunrise. The chair I'd spent 2 weeks choosing from a furniture maker in Asheville because I wanted something that would last a lifetime. His jacket hung there like he owned the place, like he had any right to make himself comfortable in the home I'd built before I ever knew his name. I was reaching for the jacket to photograph it when I heard the bedroom door open down the hallway. Footsteps on hardwood, casual and unhurried. Then Jennifer appeared, and the sight of her stole whatever breath I had left. She was wearing my robe. The silk one I kept in the guest bathroom, dove gray with delicate embroidery at the collar, a gift to myself after closing my first 8-figure deal. It hung open over her body, barely tied, her hair mussed, and her makeup smeared. She stopped when she saw me, and for 1 second, maybe 2, her eyes went wide with something that might have been shame. Then her face rearranged itself into something harder, defiant, almost victorious. "You were supposed to be in the city until Sunday," she said, and her tone was accusing, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by showing up early to my own house. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was staring at my baby sister, the girl I'd helped raise after Dad left, the one I'd paid rent for, and bailed out and believed in, despite years of evidence that she'd never change wearing my robe in my house after sleeping with my husband. David emerged behind her then, buttoning his shirt with clumsy fingers. His hair stuck up in the back. He wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at the floor like a child caught stealing cookies, guilt and resignation written across his face in equal measure. Not shock, not horror at what he'd done, just the tired acceptance of someone who'd been caught doing something he'd probably always known he'd eventually do. "Catherine," he started, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk about this." Jennifer laughed. Actually laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off my vaulted ceilings. "Oh, come on, David. Don't be pathetic." She turned to me, and what came out of her mouth next would replay in my mind for months. "You're getting older, sis. You can't really expect to keep a man satisfied anymore. You're never here. You're always working. Did you really think he'd just wait around forever?" The words should have shattered me. Maybe they would have if I'd been someone else. Instead, they crystallized something that had been forming since I saw those cars in my driveway. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. Someone I'd wasted years trying to save, trying to love, trying to believe was better than she'd ever proven herself to be. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice was quiet but clear, each word distinct. Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "David invited me. I have every right to be here." We should sit down and discuss this rationally, David added, finally looking up. You're upset, and I understand, but if we could just... I pulled out my phone again. This time, I didn't open the camera. I opened my contacts, scrolled to Margaret's name, and hit call. I held the phone away from my ear and tapped the speaker button so they could both hear it ring. Margaret answered on the second ring. Catherine, I thought you were off-grid this week. Margaret, I'm at the villa. I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions yet. My voice remained steady, professional, like I was describing a contract dispute rather than my life falling apart. I've just discovered my husband and my sister here together. Evidence of an affair. I have photographs. What do I need to do right now to protect myself legally? There was a beat of silence. Then Margaret's voice came back, no longer friendly but sharp with legal precision. Don't say a word. Don't touch anything else. Just listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. My lawyer's next words changed everything. You're in a better position than you think. Margaret's voice cut through the speaker with surgical precision. Catherine, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not engage with either of them. Do not argue. Do not explain yourself. Do not give them any ammunition whatsoever to claim you were threatening, unstable, or emotionally volatile. Do you understand me? Yes. I said, my voice flat. Good. I need you to leave that house right now. Walk out, get in your car, and drive to my office. Let them think they've won this round. Let them think you're running away hurt and humiliated. We'll meet in 2 hours, and you'll bring me every single photograph you took. Can you do that? I looked at Jennifer standing there in my robe, smirking like she'd just conquered something. I looked at David, who'd finally found the courage to meet my eyes. His expression a mixture of guilt and what looked almost like relief that the secret was finally out. Margaret's words echoed in my head. Emotion is the enemy. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to give them a scene they could later reframe as Catherine being unreasonable. Catherine overreacting. Catherine losing control. I would not give them that satisfaction. You have 48 hours to remove your belongings from this property. I said, my voice as calm as if I were discussing a routine business transaction. After that, anything remaining becomes my property and will be disposed of as I see fit. Jennifer's laugh was ugly, sharp-edged. God, you're pathetic. Even now you can't just be human for once. Always so cold, so controlled. No wonder he needed someone with actual warmth. David opened his mouth, something that might have been an apology or an explanation forming on his lips, but I was already turning away. I walked through my great room, past the wine glasses and dying candles, past the evidence of their afternoon together in my sanctuary. My legs felt mechanical, each step deliberate and measured. I would not run. I would not flee like a wounded animal. At the doorway I paused and turned back. They stood together in the center of the room, Jennifer's hand possessively on David's arm, both of them backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the windows I'd positioned specifically to catch that golden light. I raised my phone one last time and took a photograph. The two of them framed in the doorway of my sanctuary, surrounded by my furniture and my carefully chosen decor, standing in the home they had no right to occupy. They looked smaller than they should have, somehow diminished by the space around them. Neither of them spoke as I walked out. I got into my Range Rover and started the engine, forcing myself to back up slowly, carefully, like this was any normal departure. In the rearview mirror, I watched them standing on the porch, watching me leave. Jennifer had her arms crossed, now triumphant. David had his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. They probably thought they'd broken me. They probably thought I'd go cry in some hotel room and eventually slink back defeated and willing to negotiate some humiliating reconciliation. They had no idea what was coming. The gate closed behind me with a solid clang, and I began the descent down the mountain. The golden aspens blurred past my windows. My hands gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2, the way I'd been taught in driver's education 36 years ago. My breathing was controlled, measured. In through the nose for 4 counts, out through the mouth for 4 counts. a technique I'd learned in a stress management seminar during my first year as a junior associate. I did not cry. Instead, I began making a mental inventory. The villa had been purchased with $1.8 million of inheritance money from my mother received before my marriage to David. Separate property under Colorado law, not subject to marital division. I'd consulted with Margaret about asset protection 3 years ago after Jennifer had borrowed $15,000 for what she'd called an emergency. Her car had broken down, she'd said, and she needed it for work. I'd written the check and watched her drive away in the same Lexus that was currently parked in my driveway. The car had never been broken. The emergency had never existed. The loan had never been repaid. That betrayal had seemed significant at the time. I'd been disappointed that my sister could lie to me so easily. Margaret had suggested I take steps to protect my assets more formally. We'd established an irrevocable trust with the villa as its primary holding, naming me as the sole beneficiary with specific instructions that under no circumstances could the property pass to Jennifer regardless of what happened to me. At the time, it had seemed almost paranoid. Now it seemed prescient. The trust documents were ironclad. Margaret had made sure of that. David's name appeared nowhere on the title, the deed, or the trust paperwork. He'd signed a post-nuptial agreement 2 years into our marriage when I'd refinanced some business properties and needed clean documentation of separate versus marital assets. He'd signed without argument, probably without even reading it carefully. By the time I reached the highway and merged into traffic heading back toward Denver, I wasn't Catherine Walsh, the betrayed wife. I was Catherine Walsh, the senior partner who'd built a career on outmaneuvering opponents who underestimated her. My mind was clicking through scenarios, calculating moves and countermoves, identifying leverage points and vulnerabilities. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that every sound in that house had been recorded for the past 6 months. Margaret's office was exactly as I remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with leather-bound law volumes, the rich smell of coffee from the espresso machine she'd installed 5 years ago, and afternoon light filtering through wooden blinds that cast geometric shadows across her mahogany desk. She'd already cleared her schedule when I called from the road. 20 years of friendship meant she knew that when I asked for help, the situation was serious. I transferred all 73 photographs from my phone to her computer while she made us both coffee. She didn't ask questions, just studied each image with the analytical focus that had made her one of Denver's top property attorneys. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between fury and fierce satisfaction. "Catherine, do you remember what we did 3 years ago?" she asked, pulling a file from her cabinet. "After Jennifer borrowed that money and never paid you back." The memory came flooding back. I'd been sitting in this same chair, frustrated and hurt, telling Margaret how my sister had lied about needing car repairs. Margaret had listened patiently, then said something that had seemed almost paranoid at the time. "Family and money are the 2 things that destroy more estates than anything else. We need to protect your assets formally." "The irrevocable trust," I said slowly. "Exactly." She opened the file and spread documents across her desk. "We established a trust with your villa as the primary asset. Do you remember why we chose an irrevocable structure? Because it can't be changed or dissolved without the beneficiary's consent." "Correct. And more importantly, because you funded this trust entirely with separate property, your mother's inheritance received 5 years before your marriage to David." Margaret pulled out a highlighted copy of Colorado property law statutes. Under state law, inheritance received before or during marriage remains separate property if it's never commingled with marital funds. You bought that land with your mother's money. You paid for construction with your mother's money. David never contributed a single dollar. She slid the trust documents toward me, and I saw my own signature from 3 years ago, dated just 2 months after Jennifer's betrayal over the loan. My past self had been wiser than I'd given her credit for. I'd protected my future without even knowing I'd need that protection. "This means David has 0 legal claim to the property." Margaret continued, her finger tracing through the relevant sections. "Not in a divorce, not through any spousal property rights, nothing." And the trust specifically states that under no circumstances can the property pass to Jennifer regardless of what happens to you. You made sure of that. A weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying lifted slightly from my chest. So they can't take it. They can't touch it. But more than that, they don't even have the right to be there. Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began writing in her precise, angular script. Neither David nor Jennifer are on the title. Neither are on the trust documents. Neither pay property taxes, insurance, or contribute to maintenance. They're not tenants because there's no lease and no rent payment. Legally, they're trespassers. She looked up at me and her expression was almost predatory. We're going to file a formal 30-day eviction notice. It will be served by a process server tomorrow morning at dawn. The notice will cite unauthorized occupancy and trespassing. After 30 days, if they haven't vacated, we'll file for unlawful detainer and have the sheriff physically remove them. 30 days, I repeated. It felt like an eternity. I know it seems long, but we have to follow proper legal procedure. Colorado law requires it even for trespassers. But Catherine, this isn't about revenge. This is pure property law. You're not being vindictive or cruel, you're being legally correct. That distinction matters in court. She pulled her laptop closer and began drafting the notice. I watched the words appear on screen, each sentence crafted with surgical precision. No emotional language, no accusations, just facts. The property owner, the trust documents, the lack of authorization for occupancy, the legal requirement to vacate within 30 days. When she finished, she printed 3 copies and had me review them. The language was perfect, cold, professional, unassailable. Now the documentation protocol, Margaret said, reaching into her drawer and pulling out a leather journal with my initials embossed on the cover. She must have ordered it while I was driving down from the mountain. This is your chronicle. Starting right now, you document everything. Every text message from David or Jennifer, every phone call, every attempt at contact. Date, time, exact words if possible, and any witnesses present. If they show up at your office or your apartment, you document it. If they send flowers or letters or flying monkeys in the form of mutual friends, you document it. She opened the journal to the first page where she'd already written today's date and Initial Discovery Villa as a header. You write in here every single day, even if it's just to note that there was no contact. In court, contemporaneous documentation is gold. It shows you're credible, organized, and truthful. I took the journal feeling the weight of it in my hands. It felt less like a diary and more like a weapon. If either of them tries to contact you directly, you don't respond, Margaret continued. Not with anger, not with hurt, not at all. You forward everything to me, and I handle all communication. Every photograph you took today gets uploaded to 3 separate locations: my secure server, your personal cloud backup, and an external hard drive I'll give you. We create redundancy, so nothing can be lost or claimed to be fabricated. She poured us both more coffee and met my eyes with an intensity that reminded me why she'd never lost a property case in her career. Catherine, in court, the person with the best records wins, and you're going to have impeccable records. By the time we're done, every action you take will be documented, justified, and legally bulletproof. The eviction notice was served at dawn, but by afternoon, something far more disturbing arrived at Margaret's office. What arrived was a single sheet of paper faxed from the county recorder's office in response to Margaret's property records request. She'd called me immediately, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, and told me to come back to her office. Now I sat staring at a loan application dated 3 weeks ago bearing what appeared to be my signature on 6 different pages. Except I'd never seen these documents before in my life. We'd stared at that forged signature together for a full minute before Margaret had said the words that transformed this from a marriage betrayal into something criminal. Now I was checked into the Brown Palace Hotel under my maiden name, sitting in a corner suite on the 8th floor, trying to process the reality that my husband hadn't just cheated on me, he'd attempted to steal from me. The hotel phone rang at 6:30 that evening. I almost didn't answer, but the front desk clerk's apologetic voice came through when I picked up. Ms. Walsh. I'm so sorry to disturb you, but there's a Patricia Walsh here in the lobby asking to see you. She says she's family. Should I send her up, or would you prefer I tell her you're unavailable? Patricia, David's mother. A woman who'd spent 15 years making it subtly clear that her son had married beneath his station. I'd met her perhaps a dozen times always at obligatory holiday gatherings where she'd worn designer suits that cost more than my first car and made delicate comments about my career consuming so much of my time. She'd never visited me anywhere before. The fact that she was here now uninvited meant something. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory from earlier that afternoon. Information is power. If anyone from David's side tries to contact you, don't shut them down. Listen more than you speak. People tell you everything if you just let them talk long enough. Tell her I'll meet her in the lobby bar in 15 minutes, I said. I changed out of the yoga pants I'd been living in and put on one of my work suits, charcoal gray, tailored the armor I wore into difficult negotiations. When I walked into the lobby bar, Patricia was already seated at a corner table looking like she'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed. Her cream-colored cashmere sweater probably cost $2,000, and the rings on her fingers caught the soft lighting as she raised a hand to wave me over. "Catherine, dear," she said as I approached her, tone dripping with a concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you so much for agreeing to see me. I know this must be such a difficult time." I sat across from her, noting that she'd already ordered tea for both of us. The assumption that I'd want what she wanted was typically Patricia. She'd been making decisions for other people her entire life. "I won't take much of your time," she continued, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her rings were cold against my skin, the diamond in her engagement ring easily 3 carats. "I just wanted to talk to you woman to woman about this unfortunate situation." "Unfortunate," I repeated, keeping my voice neutral. "These things happen in long marriages, Catherine. Men make mistakes." She smiled, the practiced expression of someone who'd forgiven countless transgressions. "My own husband had his indiscretions over the years. I chose to be the bigger person to understand that marriage requires flexibility. I'm sure your mother taught you the same thing, that sometimes we have to overlook certain lapses in judgment." My mother had taught me no such thing, but I said nothing. I picked up my tea and took a small sip, watching Patricia over the rim of the cup. "You're at an age now where starting over would be quite difficult." Patricia continued, her tone still gentle, but with an edge underneath. "Your biological clock has certainly run out, and the dating pool for women in their 50s is rather limited. David is a good provider. He's always taken care of you. Perhaps this is an opportunity to examine what you might have done to drive him to this." I set down my cup, carefully, still silent. The blame shifting was textbook manipulation, take the victim's betrayal, and somehow make it her fault. Patricia was good at this. She'd probably been doing it her entire marriage. "What I'm suggesting," Patricia said, leaning forward slightly, "is that you consider being reasonable about this. David made a mistake with your sister, yes, but it doesn't have to end your marriage. With a little understanding, a little forgiveness, everyone can move forward." She paused, smoothing her napkin. "Once the refinancing clears next week, everyone can settle down and think rationally about what's best for the family." The words hit me like ice water. Refinancing. Next week. I kept my face absolutely still, years of poker-faced negotiations serving me now. I took another sip of tea, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "Refinancing," I said finally, my tone merely curious. Patricia's eyes widened slightly. She'd realized her mistake. "Oh, I thought I assumed David had discussed the financial arrangements with you." She was backpedaling now, her polished composure cracking at the edges. "I'm sure it's nothing to concern yourself with. Just routine financial planning." "I see," I said, setting down my cup. "Patricia, would you excuse me for just a moment? I need to use the restroom." I walked calmly across the lobby, my heels clicking on marble floors. But the moment I was out of sight, I pulled out my phone and typed rapidly to Margaret. He tried to refinance the villa. Check all property records now. Patricia just let it slip closing next week. In the restroom, I stood at the sink and gripped the cold porcelain, staring at my reflection. My face was pale but composed. My hands weren't shaking. I looked like someone in control, even though everything inside me was screaming. When I returned to the table 5 minutes later, Patricia was gone. Her teacup sat empty, her napkin folded precisely beside it, and a $50 bill lay on the table for tea that had cost perhaps $12. She'd run. My phone buzzed in my purse. Margaret's response came within the hour. They forged your signature. This isn't infidelity anymore, it's fraud. Margaret had her investigator pull every document filed with the county recorder's office in the past year. By the next morning, we sat in her conference room surrounded by printouts that told a story more calculated and cruel than simple infidelity. The refinancing application was dated exactly 3 weeks ago, submitted to Mountain States Federal Credit Union for $1.5 million against the villa's appraised value of $2 million. My alleged signature appeared on 6 different pages: the application itself, the property disclosure, the authorization to pull credit, the statement of assets and liabilities, the acknowledgement of terms, and the final certification page. Margaret slid them across the table to me one by one, and I studied each signature with the analytical eye I'd developed, reviewing contracts for 3 decades. The forgeries were good, better than I would have expected. Someone had studied the loops and curves of how I signed my name. But they weren't perfect. My actual signature had a distinctive quirk in the way I crossed the T in Catherine, a habit formed in 3rd grade when Mrs. Henderson had praised my penmanship. These signatures were close, but that small detail was wrong. Federal forgery statutes carry up to 10 years in prison, Margaret said, tapping her pen against the table. This isn't just civil fraud, Catherine. This is criminal. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled another document from the pile, this one from the Secretary of State's Business Entity Database. The loan application lists the purpose as Investment Capital for Silver Echo Fund, LLC. Does that name mean anything to you? I shook my head, but something cold was forming in my stomach. It wouldn't, Margaret said, because you're not involved with it. But Jennifer is. She registered this LLC 6 months ago, listing herself as managing member and sole owner. The business purpose is listed as investment management and financial consulting. She's been setting up what appears to be some kind of investment fund. With what capital? I asked. Jennifer hasn't held a steady job in years. She lives off credit cards and loans she never repays. Exactly, which is why she needed your villa. $1.5 million in liquid capital from a refinance would give her the seed money to actually operate this fund, or more likely to run some kind of scheme that looks like a legitimate investment fund but is actually just a way to funnel money. Margaret pulled up something on her laptop and turned it to face me. She's been advertising on social media for the past month. Exclusive investment opportunities for sophisticated women investors. 10% quarterly returns guaranteed. It's textbook fraud setup. The pieces were clicking together in my mind with sickening clarity. Jennifer hadn't seduced my husband out of attraction or even revenge. She'd done it because she needed access to my property. The affair was tactical, a means to an end. There's more, Margaret said quietly. She retrieved another document from a file I hadn't noticed before, older, more worn. Your mother's original will from 5 years ago. I had my assistant pull it from the probate records. There's a clause on page 7 you might not remember. I took the document and found the section she'd marked. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was clear. In the event of the death or divorce of my elder daughter, Catherine, the mountain property purchased with inheritance funds shall pass to my younger daughter, Jennifer. The words blurred as I read them again. My mother had written this. My mother, who'd wanted me to have a place of peace, had also included a provision that would give that same place to Jennifer if I died or divorced. It felt like a betrayal from beyond the grave, even though I knew my mother had probably just been trying to be fair to make sure both daughters were provided for. This is what Jennifer was counting on, Margaret said. She wanted you to divorce David. That would trigger this clause, and she'd inherit the villa. Except she doesn't know about the trust we set up 3 years ago. The irrevocable trust supersedes this will completely. The trust document explicitly states that under no circumstances can the property pass to Jennifer, regardless of what happens to you. I set down the will and looked at Margaret. So she orchestrated an affair to force a divorce that would give her property she thinks she'll inherit but legally can't. That's exactly what she did. And David went along with it, probably promised a share of whatever scheme she's running with Silver Echo. Margaret opened a folder containing phone records. My investigator pulled these this morning. 6 months ago, David and Jennifer started communicating regularly. Dozens of calls, hundreds of texts. 5 months ago, the pattern intensifies. Look at this cluster here, 3 and 4 calls a day, some lasting over an hour. She flipped to another page covered in highlighted entries. 3 months ago, something changes. The calls become shorter but more frequent. And here, she pointed to a date circled in red. Jennifer made a call to a private investigator in Illinois. That investigator specializes in locating people who've changed their names. 2 days later, she called someone named Linda Hoffman in Peoria. Who's Linda Hoffman? I asked. I don't know yet, but we will. The point is, Jennifer was researching something about David's past. Whatever she found, she used it. Because right after that call, David's communication pattern changes. He starts calling her where before it was always her calling him. The power dynamic shifted. Margaret pulled out a large whiteboard and began constructing a timeline with different colored markers. 6 months ago in blue, Jennifer registers Silver Echo Fund, LLC. 5 months ago in green, regular contact between Jennifer and David begins. 3 months ago in red, Jennifer investigates David's past, discovers something. 2 months ago in purple, affair becomes physical credit card records show hotel charges. 1 month ago in orange, forged refinancing application submitted. This week in black, villa meeting assuming Catherine arrives Sunday. The timeline stretched across the board like a surgical plan. Every step calculated, every action deliberate. This wasn't romance or passion or even simple opportunism. This was premeditated theft dressed up as an affair. They thought they had it all figured out, Margaret said, capping her marker. Force you into a divorce through the humiliation of the affair, trigger the will provision. Jennifer gets the villa, they split the refinancing money and fund her scheme. They probably figured you'd be so devastated you'd just accept it. I stared at that timeline, at the months of planning that had gone into destroying my life, and felt something crystallize inside me. Not rage anymore, but cold determination. They'd underestimated me. They'd assumed I was weak, that I'd crumble, that I'd never fight back effectively. Margaret, I said slowly, 2 years ago when I renovated the villa, I installed a smart home system. Voice-activated speakers in every room for music and home control. They back up to cloud storage automatically. Margaret's eyes widened. Tell me you still have access to those backups. I do. I never thought to check them because I never imagined I'd need to. I pulled out my phone. But there was one element they hadn't planned for. I'd installed a smart speaker system 2 years ago, and every word they'd said in my home had been automatically backed up to the cloud. Back in Margaret's office, I logged into my Apple account on her computer, navigating to the smart home application I hadn't opened in months. The villa's system appeared with all its connected devices, thermostats, lighting controls, security cameras, and the 6 voice-activated speakers I'd installed in the great room, kitchen, master bedroom, guest bedroom, and both upstairs and downstairs hallways. Each speaker had been recording audio snippets whenever someone spoke a wake word or command. I'd set up the system 2 years ago primarily for music and climate control, then essentially forgotten about it because it had become so seamlessly integrated into the house. Margaret leaned over my shoulder as I clicked through to the backup files. There were hundreds of them organized by date and location. Some were just a few seconds long play jazz, or set temperature to 70, but others ran for minutes capturing conversations that happened near the devices after they'd been activated. Colorado is a one-party consent state. Margaret said, her voice measured and professional. That means only one party to a conversation needs to consent to recording. You own the home, you own the devices, and you're technically a party to anything that happens in your property. These recordings are almost certainly admissible in court. But even if a judge excludes them for some reason, they're invaluable for understanding exactly what we're dealing with. We'll know their strategy, their motivation, every detail of their planning. How do we start? I asked, staring at the screen full of files. Chronologically, from 6 months ago when the phone records show their contact began. She pulled up a chair beside me. Catherine, this is going to be hard. You're going to hear things that will hurt. But I need you to think of these recordings like evidence from a crime scene. Detach yourself emotionally as much as you can. We're gathering intelligence, not reliving trauma. Can you do that? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed myself. Margaret clicked on a file dated 6 months ago, recorded in the villa's great room. The audio quality was surprisingly clear. David's voice came through the speakers, and hearing it made my chest tighten. I don't know why she needs to work this much. We have more money than we'll ever spend. It's like she's trying to prove something constantly. Jennifer's voice, sympathetic and warm in a way I'd never heard her speak to me. She's always been like that even when we were kids. First in her class, first to get promoted, first to make $1 million. It's exhausting just watching her. I can't imagine what it's like being married to that. Sometimes I feel more like an accessory than a husband, David said. Like I'm just another item on her achievement list. The file ended. Margaret clicked to the next one 2 weeks later, same location. Their conversation had shifted from complaint to speculation. Jennifer's voice, "This place must be worth what $2 million more the land alone has probably appreciated." She bought it before we got married, David said. It's in some kind of trust, I don't fully understand it. Her mother left her the money. Catherine handled all the legal stuff without really explaining it to me. That must feel terrible, Jennifer purred. Being shut out of major financial decisions in your own marriage. We continued through the files, watching the timeline progress. 4 months ago, the tone shifted noticeably. She doesn't appreciate you, Jennifer said in one recording. She's so focused on her career, on her next deal, on proving herself, she doesn't see what she has right in front of her. If I had a husband like you, I'd actually be present. I had to pause the playback. My hands were shaking. Margaret reached over and squeezed my shoulder. Do you need a break? No, I said. Keep going. 3 months ago, the critical recording. They were in the kitchen this time, and the conversation had moved beyond emotional affair territory into something darker. Jennifer's voice was different here, calculating, excited. David, I need to tell you something. About my mother's will. There's a clause that says if Catherine gets divorced, the villa passes to me. I inherit it. Do you understand what that means? A long pause. Then David, you want me to divorce her? I want us to be together. And I want both of us to be secure. If she divorces you, I get the house. We could sell it, split the money, start over somewhere new, or keep it. Either way, we'd both be set. Another pause. But there's something I need to know first. There's something in your past, isn't there? Something Catherine doesn't know about? David's voice went flat. Who told you that? Nobody told me. I looked. There was a woman named Linda Hoffman who tried to contact you a few months ago. Your spam folder. You deleted her email, but I saw it before you did. David, there's something you should know about my past, too. I'm very good at finding information people want hidden. I felt sick. Jennifer had been spying on David's email, using whatever she'd found as leverage. This wasn't just conspiracy, it was calculated manipulation. The recordings from the last 2 months made the earlier ones look almost innocent. They discussed the refinancing openly, casually, like they were planning a vacation. I've been practicing her signature, Jennifer said in one file, laughing. She dots her I's so precisely, like everything else she does. So controlled. So perfect. It's actually easier to forge than I thought. What if the loan doesn't go through? David asked. Then we establish residency at the villa. Claim tenant rights make it legally complicated for her to evict us. That buys us time to figure out Plan C. In another recording from 3 weeks ago, Jennifer laid out the entire strategy. Best case scenario, she divorces you, and I get the house through the will. Worst case, the refinancing clears and we split $1.5 million before she even knows what happened. Either way, we win. What if she fights back? David asked, and for the first time, I heard doubt in his voice. Jennifer's laugh was cruel and confident. She won't. Catherine's too proud to admit her marriage failed. She'll be humiliated, devastated, and she'll do what she always does when things get hard. She'll disappear into her work and pretend nothing happened. She'll quietly file for divorce through lawyers, avoid confrontation, and try to save face. I've watched her do it her whole life. She'd rather suffer in silence than let anyone see her lose control. I listened to my sister describe me like I was predictable, weak, manageable, and something inside me broke apart and reformed into something harder, sharper, more determined. She'd spent our entire lives studying me, and she thought she had me figured out. She thought I'd disappear quietly. She had no idea how wrong she was. There's one more, Margaret said quietly. From the morning you arrived. Do you want to hear it? I nodded, bracing myself. The next recording was from the morning I arrived, and what they said about me while I was driving up that mountain made my lawyer's jaw drop. The recording from that morning was time-stamped at 9:47 a.m., about 6 hours before I arrived. Jennifer's voice came through clear and bright, almost giddy. She just texted David that she's staying in the city until Sunday. We have the whole weekend. God, this is almost too easy. David's response was quieter, uncertain. Are you sure we should be here? What if she comes back early? She won't. Catherine is nothing if not predictable. When she says Sunday, she means Sunday at exactly 4 p.m., not a minute earlier. Besides, even if she did show up, what's she going to do? Make a scene. Please. She'd die before letting anyone see her lose control. The great Catherine Walsh, always so composed, so professional, she'll probably just send a passive-aggressive email. Margaret and I sat in silence after the file ended. Her jaw was literally hanging open. She said that 6 hours before you arrived and caught them. She was wrong about me, I said, and my voice sounded strange even to myself, cold, determined. She's been wrong about me my entire life, and now we're going to prove it. Margaret made a call that afternoon to a forensic accountant she'd worked with on previous fraud cases. David Chen arrived at her office an hour later, a slight man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and the intense focus of someone who genuinely loved untangling financial crimes. He reviewed everything we had on Silver Echo Fund, the LLC registration, Jennifer's social media, advertising the loan application that would have funded it, and within 20 minutes he'd seen enough. Classic affinity fraud, he said, spreading Jennifer's promotional materials across the conference table. She's targeting women in their 40s through 60s, probably from her social circles or yours. Exclusive investment opportunities for sophisticated women investors. That's code for, I'm going to tell you this is only for smart people like you, which will make you feel special and less likely to do due diligence. 10% quarterly returns guaranteed. That's 40% annually. No legitimate investment guarantees that, especially not in this market. Can we prove it's fraudulent? Margaret asked. Not yet, because she hasn't actually taken anyone's money. She's still in fundraising mode. But here's what I suggest. Chen leaned forward, his eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. Catherine, you approach Silver Echo as an anonymous investor. We create a new identity, use a friend's LLC, get a virtual phone number, set up an untraceable email. You express interest in investing, say, $500,000. Let her pitch you. Record everything. Let her incriminate herself with her own words. The idea was bold and risky, and exactly what Jennifer would never expect from me. How do we do it? Within 3 hours, we'd created the identity of Victoria Meadows, principal of Meadows Capital, LLC, an entity that actually existed and belonged to my college roommate Sarah, who'd built a successful private equity firm in Boston. Sarah had agreed immediately when I'd called her furious on my behalf and eager to help. Chen set up a virtual phone number and a Gmail account that couldn't be traced back to me. Then I drafted an inquiry email trying to sound like a wealthy woman who was interested but cautious. I sent it at 7 p.m. I came across your materials for Silver Echo Fund through a mutual contact. I'm interested in learning more about your investment strategy. I'm currently exploring opportunities for $500K in capital. Please advise on next steps. Jennifer responded within 2 hours. Her email was warm, professional, and perfectly calibrated to inspire confidence. Victoria, thank you so much for reaching out. Silver Echo focuses on sustainable luxury real estate investments with a proven track record of consistent returns. I'd love to tell you more about our unique approach and our community of sophisticated women investors. Are you available for a call tomorrow? Over the next 3 days, we played the game perfectly. I called her as Victoria, my voice slightly higher than normal, my manner eager but cautious. Jennifer's pitch was polished and persuasive. She described Silver Echo as a women-supporting women investment fund that specialized in boutique luxury properties in emerging markets. The returns she promised, 10% quarterly guaranteed, made Chen shake his head in disbelief, even as he listened to the recording. She emailed a presentation deck that was genuinely impressive if you didn't know what to look for. Glossy photos of luxury properties graphs showing projected returns, testimonials from satisfied investors that Chen later verified were stock photos with fake names. She claimed the fund already had anchor investors and was nearly fully subscribed, creating artificial urgency. When I asked about her credentials and whether the fund was registered with the SEC, she became vague, talking about proprietary strategies and accredited investor exemptions that didn't actually apply. She's good at this, Chen admitted. If I didn't know better, I'd almost believe her. On the 4th day, I played my hand. Jennifer, I'm very interested, but before I commit $500,000, I need to meet in person. Can we arrange that? She agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at the Four Seasons downtown. Margaret Chen and I spent an entire day coordinating the logistics. We'd meet in a private conference room that Margaret had reserved. Chen would attend as my financial advisor. And we'd have FBI agents positioned in the building not to arrest anyone yet, but to observe and potentially intervene if needed. Margaret had a contact in the white-collar crime division who'd been very interested in the signature forgery and was now equally interested in securities fraud. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. on Friday. I barely slept the night before, my mind oscillating between anticipation and an unexpected sadness. This was my sister. The girl who'd shared a bedroom with me until I was 13. The one I'd helped with homework and defended from bullies and believed in despite years of evidence that maybe I shouldn't. Now I was setting a trap that would likely send her to prison. But she'd tried to steal from me. She'd seduced my husband as part of a calculated plan. She'd forged my signature. She'd built an entire fraud scheme that would have hurt other women if we didn't stop it. I dressed carefully that morning, a navy suit, minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in a way that Victoria Meadows might wear it. Margaret and Chen met me in the lobby at 9:30. The FBI agents were already in position, dressed like hotel guests, invisible unless you knew to look for them. At exactly 10 a.m., the conference room door opened. Jennifer walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing her most expensive suit, her smile confident and warm. When my sister walked into that conference room and saw me sitting at the head of the table, the color drained from her face, but the FBI agents behind her blocked the exit. Jennifer froze in the doorway, her confident smile collapsing like a building in controlled demolition. Her eyes locked on mine, and I watched the recognition flood through her, the understanding that Victoria Meadows didn't exist, that she'd been pitching her fraud scheme to her own sister for the past week. For 3 long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence was so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming above us. Her gaze darted to the door behind her, where 2 people in dark suits stood with the unnaturally still posture of federal agents. They hadn't identified themselves yet, but Jennifer was smart enough to recognize law enforcement when she saw it. Her leather portfolio slipped slightly in her hands, and I saw her knuckles go white as she gripped it tighter. "What are you doing here?" She finally managed her voice thin and strained. I gestured to the chair across from me with the same calm authority I'd used in 1,000 business negotiations. "I'm the investor you've been pitching to for the past week, Jennifer. Victoria Meadows. I wanted to hear more about Silver Echo Fund in person. Please sit down." She remained standing, her body rigid, her eyes darting between me, Chen Margaret, and the two figures by the door. "This is insane. You're insane. This is some kind of setup." "My name is David Chen," Chen said, his voice professionally pleasant. "I'm a forensic accountant specializing in investment fraud. I've been reviewing your Silver Echo materials with great interest." That's when Jennifer understood she wasn't walking out of this room on her own terms. Her face went from pale to flushed anger, replacing shock. "I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything without a lawyer." The two people by the door stepped forward, and the taller one, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair, pulled out credentials. "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Morris, FBI White Collar Crime Division. This is Special Agent Tom Brennan. Ms. Walsh, we're not here to arrest you today. We're here to ask you some questions and give you an opportunity to cooperate with an ongoing investigation into securities fraud related to Silver Echo Fund, LLC. "I don't have to answer anything," Jennifer said, but her voice wavered. "That's absolutely correct," Agent Morris agreed. "You have every right to remain silent and request an attorney. However, I want you to understand the situation you're in. We already have sufficient evidence to pursue charges based on your communications with the person you believe to be Victoria Meadows. What happens next depends largely on your willingness to cooperate." Jennifer finally sat down, her portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield. Over the next hour, I watched my sister systematically dismantled. Agent Morris walked through the Silver Echo presentation deck page by page, asking questions that seemed simple but were carefully designed to expose the fraud. "Where did this 10% quarterly return figure come from? Can you show us historical performance data?" Jennifer stammered that it was projected based on market analysis. "Can you provide contact information for these anchor investors you mentioned in your emails?" She claimed they wanted to remain anonymous for privacy reasons. "Why isn't Silver Echo Fund registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission?" She tried to explain something about accredited investor exemptions that clearly she didn't understand herself, and Chen interjected to point out that her explanation didn't actually align with SEC regulations. Agent Brennan pulled out the LLC registration documents showing Jennifer's signature as managing member and sole owner. When she tried to claim she was just a nominee and didn't really run the company, he produced emails from her personal account discussing the fund's strategy, marketing approach, and financial projections. When she attempted to pivot and suggest this was all David's idea, that he'd manipulated her into it, Agent Morris produced the timeline showing Jennifer had registered the LLC a full month before the affair had even started, according to the smart home recordings. With each question, Jennifer became more defensive, her answers contradictory and desperate. She'd gone from confident businesswoman to cornered animal in less than an hour. I sat silently through most of it, watching the sister I thought I knew reveal herself to be someone I'd never truly understood. She wasn't just greedy or envious, she was fundamentally dishonest in a way that went bone deep. Finally, Agent Morris and Agent Brennan excused themselves to make phone calls, leaving Jennifer and me alone in the conference room with Margaret and Chen discreetly positioned near the windows. The moment the door closed, Jennifer's composure shattered completely. She started crying, but these weren't tears of remorse. They were angry, bitter, resentful sobs that shook her entire body. "You were always the successful one," she choked out between gasps. "Always the one Mom was so proud of. Catherine got promoted again. Catherine closed another deal. Catherine bought a house on the mountain. She left you everything, the money, the villa, all of it. What was I supposed to do? Just watch you win forever?" I felt a complicated surge of emotions: anger at her betrayal, pity for the pain that had twisted her into this, and genuine grief for the relationship we'd once had when we were children, sharing secrets in the dark. But underneath it all was a core of steel that wouldn't bend. You were supposed to build your own life, Jennifer, not steal mine. Her tear-streaked face contorted with rage. You don't deserve any of it. You were never even happy. You worked yourself to death, ignored your husband, lived alone in that giant house like some kind of ice queen. At least I would have appreciated what I had. At least I would have lived. The words hit harder than I expected, because somewhere deep down there was a grain of truth in them. I had been so focused on achieving, on building, on proving myself, that I'd forgotten to ask whether any of it was making me happy. My marriage had been empty for years, I just hadn't wanted to admit it. But that painful truth didn't justify what she'd done. Being unhappy doesn't mean I deserved to be robbed, I said quietly. And you being jealous doesn't excuse fraud. Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, but the conference room door opened. Agent Morris and Agent Brennan returned, and the expression on Morris's face had changed harder now, more official. She was carrying handcuffs. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out reflexively and saw a message from an unknown number. You need to know what else he did. Meet me tomorrow. Linda. I met Linda Hoffman the next morning at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, a quiet place with worn wooden tables and the smell of fresh ground beans that reminded me of simpler times. She'd suggested meeting somewhere public and neutral, and when she walked through the door at exactly 9 o'clock, I recognized her immediately from the age-progressed photo I'd found through reverse image searching her phone number. She was 70 now, with silver hair cut short and practical, wearing a cardigan, despite the mild September weather. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached my table, and I saw in her eyes the same wariness I'd seen in my own mirror for the past 2 weeks. "Catherine," she asked, and when I nodded, she sat down heavily like the weight of what she was carrying had become physical. "Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you would. Your message said I needed to know what else David did. That's not something I could ignore." She ordered tea when the server came by, wrapping her hands around the cup when it arrived as though drawing warmth from it. "I saw the news coverage about the Silver Echo investigation. There was an article in the Denver Business Journal mentioning Jennifer Walsh being questioned about securities fraud. I Googled her name and her Facebook profile came up. She had photos from last year her at some charity event with a man identified as David Walsh." Linda pulled out her phone and showed me the photo she'd saved. I recognized him instantly. 20 years, some gray hair, a few more lines around the eyes, but that face, I'd know it anywhere. "His name wasn't Walsh when you knew him," I said, already understanding. "No, it was David Brennan. He legally changed it after our divorce as part of the settlement agreement. Started over with a clean slate." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo album, the kind people used to keep before everything went digital. She opened it to show me pictures from the late 1990s, a younger Linda standing beside a man who was unmistakably David, maybe 40 pounds lighter, and with darker hair, but the same smile, the same eyes that had once made me feel seen and cherished. "He did to you exactly what he did to me," Linda said quietly, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. "And I've spent 20 years wondering if I could have warned someone, if I could have stopped him from doing it again." Her story unfolded over the next hour, and with every detail I felt my understanding of my marriage shift and reform into something darker. Linda had met David when she was 48, newly widowed after her husband died in a car accident. She'd had a paid-off house in a good neighborhood, a life insurance settlement of nearly $300,000, and a teaching pension. She'd been grieving and lonely when David appeared in her life, charming, attentive, seemingly understanding her loss in ways her friends couldn't. "He told me he'd lost his own spouse years before," Linda said, staring into her tea. "It was a lie, of course. Everything about him was a lie. But at the time, I believed him. He seemed to really see me, not as a widow or a middle-aged woman past her prime, but as someone worth pursuing." They'd married within a year. For the first 18 months, everything seemed perfect. Then small things started. He needed her to co-sign a loan for a business opportunity, just temporarily, until his own credit improved. He asked her to add his name to her bank accounts for convenience. He suggested refinancing her house to take advantage of better interest rates, and she'd signed the papers without reading them carefully because she trusted him. 2 years into the marriage, I came home one day and he was gone, Linda said, and her voice finally cracked. The house was refinanced for every dollar of equity. The money was gone. My savings accounts were empty. He'd taken out credit cards in my name and maxed them out. Over $400,000 just vanished. She'd tried to prosecute, had filed police reports, and hired a lawyer, but David had been meticulous. He'd gotten her to sign documents that gave him legal authority. He'd mixed the fraud with legitimate transactions in ways that made it nearly impossible to prove criminal intent. The county prosecutor had eventually told her that while what David did was morally reprehensible, proving it was criminal fraud beyond a reasonable doubt would be extremely difficult. We settled civilly, Linda said. He agreed to pay restitution over 10 years, and in exchange his record was expunged. He paid maybe $30,000 total before he stopped, and by then he'd changed his name and disappeared. I lost my home. I spent years rebuilding my credit, my savings, my life. I never remarried. I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. The parallels to my own situation were devastating. Different details, same pattern, target a successful woman with assets, use romance and charm to gain access, extract money through fraud, then disappear when exposed. I thought about the 15 years I'd spent married to David, how he'd always been just attentive enough, just affectionate enough to keep me from questioning too deeply. Linda, I said carefully, did you ever try to contact him again after the divorce? To warn anyone or confront him? She nodded, looking ashamed. 3 months ago. It was the anniversary of our divorce, and I was feeling angry about how he'd gotten away with it. I managed to track down an email address that I thought might be his. I sent him a message saying I knew what he'd done to me and I knew he'd do it again, that someone should warn his current wife. She pulled out her phone and showed me the email thread. He responded 2 days later, told me to leave the past alone or he'd make sure everyone knew I was an unstable stalker. I stared at that email exchange and suddenly everything clicked into place. Jennifer had been snooping through David's phone or computer. She'd admitted as much in the recordings when she'd mentioned finding something about his past. She must have discovered this email from Linda, traced back David's history, and realized she had leverage. She'd used Linda's existence and David's previous fraud to force him into cooperation with her villa scheme. Help me or I'll expose you and get you prosecuted for what you did to Linda. David wasn't just weak or opportunistic. He was a repeat offender who'd been trapped between two manipulators, Jennifer dangling exposure and his own past crimes making him vulnerable. It didn't excuse what he'd done to me, but it reframed everything I thought I understood about my marriage. Linda reached into her purse one more time and pulled out a manila folder that looked decades old. There's something else you should see. When I was trying to build my case against David 20 years ago, the detective assigned to my complaint did some digging. He found another woman, someone David had been involved with in 2003. She'd filed a police report but never pressed charges because she was ashamed and scared. Linda handed me the folder, and inside was a faded police report showing a complaint filed by Margaret Chen, no relation to David Chen. I verified, detailing a similar pattern of financial fraud in a romantic relationship. The pattern went back 30 years, Linda said, and I'm probably not the last person he targeted before you. The courtroom was nothing like the dramatic spaces you see on television. It was a county civil court on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, with fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people waiting for their turn before a judge. I sat beside Margaret at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded in my lap, while across the aisle David sat with his attorney, a middle-aged man named Robert Carstairs, who looked competent but overworked, the kind of lawyer you hire when your funds are limited. Jennifer sat alone at the defendant's table, representing herself after claiming she couldn't afford an attorney now that the FBI had frozen her bank accounts pending their investigation. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Kathleen Rodriguez, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses perched on her nose. Margaret had briefed me on her reputation. She'd spent 20 years handling property disputes and family court cases, and she had zero tolerance for people who tried to manipulate the system or waste her time. She'd seen every variation of families destroying each other over money, and it had made her both compassionate and ruthlessly efficient. "This court is now in session," Judge Rodriguez said, her voice carrying authority without needing to be loud. "We're here for Walsh versus Walsh case number CV 2024-8847. Ms. Thornton, you're representing the plaintiff." Margaret stood, and I watched her transform into the courtroom version of herself, precise, controlled, devastating in her clarity. "Yes, Your Honor. Catherine Walsh is seeking formal eviction of both defendants from property located at 1247 Mountain Vista Road, which she owns through an irrevocable trust. She's also seeking damages related to attempted fraud through forged refinancing documents and enforcement of the trust terms in her pending divorce from David Walsh." Over the next 2 hours, Margaret built our case with methodical precision. She presented the trust documents first, walking Judge Rodriguez through the timeline property purchased 5 years before the marriage with inheritance money transferred to an irrevocable trust 3 years ago, with explicit language that it could never be considered marital property or passed to Jennifer under any circumstances. The judge studied the documents carefully, making notes, asking occasional questions that Margaret answered with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated every possible challenge. Then came the refinancing application with my forged signature. Margaret presented the original documents alongside the handwriting analysis from a certified forensic examiner who'd compared my real signatures on dozens of other legal documents. The expert's report was damning. The signatures on the refinancing paperwork showed clear evidence of simulation, including hesitation marks and unnatural pen lifts that indicated someone carefully copying rather than naturally signing. "Your Honor," Margaret said, "these signatures were created by someone attempting to access my client's property and equity without her knowledge or consent. This is not a marital dispute. This is fraud." David's attorney Carstairs tried to mount a defense based on marital property rights, arguing that even if the villa was technically in a trust, David had contributed to the marriage and deserved consideration. Margaret dismantled this argument with Colorado property law statutes, explaining that separate property acquired before marriage with inheritance funds and placed in an irrevocable trust had been settled case law for decades. Judge Rodriguez nodded along, clearly familiar with the precedents. Jennifer kept trying to interrupt, standing up at her table and claiming that I'd given her permission to use the villa that David had invited her, that this was all a misunderstanding. Judge Rodriguez had to warn her twice about courtroom decorum. Margaret simply waited for the interruptions to end, then presented door access logs from the villa's security system, showing that Jennifer had only gained entry using David's access code, never with her own authorization, and always when I was documented as being out of town. The phone records came next, hundreds of calls and texts between Jennifer and David over 6 months, the pattern clearly showing escalation from casual contact to intense daily communication. Margaret highlighted specific dates where they'd exchanged 20 or more messages in a single day, and the timeline she'd created weeks ago appeared on a screen for the judge to review. But the moment that truly changed the atmosphere in that courtroom came when Margaret asked permission to play an audio recording. Jennifer immediately objected, jumping up from her chair. "That's a privacy violation. You can't record people without their consent." Margaret turned to address the judge calmly. "Your Honor, this recording was made on my client's property, using devices my client owns in a one-party consent state, where my client is legally considered the one party required for consent. The recording captures conversations between the defendants discussing plans to defraud my client of her property." Judge Rodriguez considered this carefully. "Ms. Walsh, do you have a legal basis for your objection beyond general privacy concerns?" Jennifer stammered, clearly out of her depth without an attorney. "It's just, she can't, that's not fair." "I'll allow the recording," Judge Rodriguez said. "You may proceed, Ms. Thornton." The courtroom fell silent as Margaret pressed play on her laptop, the audio feeding through the court's sound system with crystalline clarity. Jennifer's voice filled the space, confident and calculating. Best case scenario, she divorces him and I get the house through the will. Worst case, the refinancing goes through and we split the money before she even knows what happened. David's voice uncertain. What if she fights back? And then Jennifer's laugh cold and dismissive. She won't. She's too proud to admit her marriage failed. She'll just quietly disappear like she always does when things get hard. Margaret let the audio play for exactly 3 minutes, carefully edited to include only the most damning admissions, without any potentially prejudicial material. When it ended, the silence was profound. I watched Judge Rodriguez's face, which remained carefully neutral, but something in her eyes had hardened. She'd heard people lie in her courtroom for 20 years, and now she'd just heard the truth in the defendants' own voices. David had gone pale, staring at the table in front of him. Jennifer's face was flushed red, her hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table so hard her knuckles had gone white. Even Carstairs looked shaken, probably realizing his client had been far less honest with him than he'd believed. Judge Rodriguez removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we return, I'll have some questions. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of what we'd all heard hanging in the air. Margaret squeezed my hand briefly, a rare display of emotion from her. I sat quietly, breathing carefully, trying to maintain the composure I'd held throughout the entire proceeding. When we reconvened 15 minutes later, Judge Rodriguez looked directly at Jennifer, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The judge called a 15-minute recess, but when she returned, her first question was directed at my sister. Do you understand what perjury means? Jennifer's face went from red to white in an instant. She understood exactly what Judge Rodriguez was asking, whether she knew that lying under oath carried criminal penalties. Before she could formulate an answer, Carstairs stood and cleared his throat with the careful deliberation of someone changing tactics mid-battle. Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement. With the court's permission, I believe it will clarify several misunderstandings about his role in these events. Judge Rodriguez nodded curtly. Proceed. David stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Your Honor, I want to be completely honest. I had an affair with my wife's sister. That's true, and it's unforgivable. I allowed Jennifer access to the villa when Catherine wasn't there. That's also true, but I need to state clearly and for the record that I knew nothing about Silver Echo Fund. I knew nothing about any forged refinancing application. I had no idea Jennifer was planning to steal the property through some inheritance provision I didn't even know existed. He paused, and I could see him carefully choosing each word. Jennifer manipulated me emotionally and legally. She discovered information about my past, a previous relationship that ended badly, a woman named Linda Hoffman. Jennifer found an email from Linda and used it to blackmail me. She told me that if I didn't cooperate with her, she'd expose everything to Catherine and make sure Linda reported me for things that happened decades ago. I made a terrible moral mistake by having the affair, but I am not a criminal. Jennifer orchestrated this fraud scheme and used our relationship as cover. It was a masterful deflection, and I watched Judge Rodriguez absorb it with that same careful neutrality. Carstairs had clearly coached David on exactly how to admit just enough to seem honest while minimizing his legal exposure. He was trying to draw a bright line between infidelity morally wrong but not criminal and fraud, which was Jennifer's doing alone. But Jennifer didn't have an attorney to tell her to stay quiet. She exploded out of her chair so violently it scraped backward across the floor with a screech that made everyone wince. You lying coward! She screamed, and Judge Rodriguez immediately raised her gavel. Ms. Walsh, sit down right now or I will hold you in contempt. Jennifer ignored her, turning on David with fury that was almost physical in its intensity. This was your idea. You came to me 3 months after the affair started and said we should figure out how to get the house. You were the one who pulled up Mom's will and showed me the inheritance clause. You were the one who said we could refinance and split the money. Ms. Walsh, I'm warning you. He researched everything. Jennifer was sobbing now, her words tumbling out in a torrent. He told me Catherine would never fight back because she's too proud to admit her marriage failed. He said she'd just disappear into her work like she always does. This was his plan from the beginning, and now he's trying to pin it all on me. Carstairs was on his feet. Objecting David was shaking his head in denial, and Judge Rodriguez was banging her gavel repeatedly. But Jennifer kept going, ranting and crying and destroying whatever fragile defense either of them might have had. Through the chaos, I heard specific admissions that Margaret was frantically writing down dates, details, who said what to whom. They were both culpable, both deeply involved in planning this fraud, and Jennifer's meltdown was laying it all bare. Finally, Judge Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise with enough authority to silence even Jennifer's hysteria. Ms. Walsh, sit down immediately, or I will have the bailiff remove you from this courtroom. Mr. Walsh, you will remain silent unless addressed directly by the court. Both of you have made serious accusations against each other that this court will need to examine carefully. In the brittle silence that followed, Jennifer spoke one more sentence before collapsing back into her chair, and it was the sentence that changed everything. Derek told me this would work. He said he'd done this before, and it was foolproof. Margaret was standing before I even fully registered what I'd heard. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to investigate this Derek that Ms. Walsh just mentioned? Judge Rodriguez checked her watch, clearly exhausted by the spectacle. 30 minutes. We'll reconvene at 3:15. Margaret was already on her phone before we left the courtroom, calling her investigator and rattling off instructions. Within 20 minutes, we had preliminary information on Derek Morrison, a real estate broker whose license had been suspended 3 years ago following a mortgage fraud investigation. He'd been accused of helping clients falsify loan applications, inflating property values, and conducting straw buyer schemes. The charges had ultimately been reduced through a plea agreement, but his license was revoked. Margaret's investigator dug deeper while we waited in the courthouse cafe, and what emerged made my stomach turn. Derek had been investigated 5 years ago for targeting elderly women, specifically widows with significant home equity, and helping their romantic partners refinance properties without proper authorization. The cases had fallen apart because the victims were too ashamed to testify, and the paper trail had been carefully constructed to provide plausible deniability. Catherine, look at this, Margaret said, turning her laptop toward me. She'd pulled up records from Linda's case against David 20 years ago. The broker who'd processed Linda's fraudulent refinancing was listed in the civil complaint Derek Morrison. David and Derek had worked together before. This wasn't Jennifer's scheme that David had been pulled into. This was David's pattern that Jennifer had become part of. Derek had been advising Jennifer for 8 months, according to phone records Margaret pulled up long before the affair became physical. He'd been the architect, the one who knew how to structure these frauds to maximize profit while minimizing legal risk. We returned to the courtroom at 3:15, and Margaret immediately requested permission to present additional evidence. Judge Rodriguez allowed it, and Margaret laid out the connection between Derek, David, and Linda's case from 2 decades ago. She showed phone records proving Derek and Jennifer had been in regular contact for 8 months. She presented the disciplinary actions against Derek's broker license and the details of his previous fraud investigations. Judge Rodriguez's expression grew darker with each revelation. Is this Derek Morrison present in the courtroom today? Jennifer turned to look at the gallery where perhaps 20 people sat, curious lawyers waiting for their own cases, a court reporter, a few people I didn't recognize. She pointed at a man in the back row, middle-aged and nondescript in khakis and a polo shirt. That's him. That's Derek. Every head in the courtroom turned to look at the man Jennifer had indicated. For one frozen moment he sat perfectly still, his face carefully blank. Then he stood abruptly, and before anyone could react, he was moving toward the exit with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly how much trouble he was in. Bailiff. Judge Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip, but Derek Morrison was already through the courtroom door and running. The bailiff caught Derek Morrison in the courthouse parking garage, not because the bailiff was particularly fast, but because Derek had made the amateur mistake of forgetting which level he'd parked on. By the time court security had him in handcuffs, Special Agent Rebecca Morris and her partner Tom Brennan were already on their way. They'd been monitoring the civil proceedings because of the Silver Echo connection, and the moment Derek's name came up, everything changed. Margaret and I sat in her office 2 days later while Agent Morris explained why Derek Morrison had just become the FBI's top priority in their white-collar crime division. "We've had our eyes on this guy for almost a decade," she said, spreading files across Margaret's conference table. "He's been involved in at least a dozen mortgage fraud schemes that we know of, always managing to stay just on the edge of what we could prosecute. He'd take plea deals on state charges, pay minimal fines, and be back at it within a year. But he was always careful, kept his schemes small, intrastate targeting victims who were too ashamed or too scared to press charges publicly." "What's different now?" Margaret asked. "Silver Echo crossed state lines. Your anonymous investor persona claiming to be from Massachusetts gave us interstate wire fraud. The emails the bank account set up the solicitation of investments from multiple states, that's federal jurisdiction. Add in the pattern we're seeing with Derek's involvement in romance scams targeting older women, and we've got grounds for racketeering charges under RICO statutes." Agent Brennan opened his laptop and pulled up a database. "Once we started digging into Derek's history with your husband's background, we found connections to at least 7 other women over the past 25 years who were defrauded in almost identical patterns." He clicked through files, each one a condensed tragedy. A 65-year-old widow named Patricia Chen in 2010, who'd lost her home to a refinancing scheme orchestrated by a man she'd been dating for 2 years. Derek had been the broker. A divorced businesswoman named Sandra Kowalski in 2015, who'd had her property transferred through documents she didn't understand. Derek had notarized the paperwork. 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth Thornton, who'd co-owned a rental property that disappeared through a complicated series of transfers in 2018. Derek had facilitated every transaction. "Derek's pattern is consistent," Agent Morris said. "He identifies women with significant assets, usually home equity. Then he introduces them to men who romance them, gain their trust, get access to their finances. Derek handles the paperwork, refinancing property transfers, loan applications, all structured just legally enough that it's hard to prove criminal intent in any single case. The money disappears into business ventures that fail, and by the time the victim realizes what's happened, the romantic partner has vanished." "How many men is he working with?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. "That's what's interesting," Agent Brennan said. "Sometimes it's his brother Marcus Morrison. Sometimes it's other associates. But in at least 4 cases, including Linda Hoffman's, it was the same man your husband used to be, David Brennan, before he changed his name. We're building a case that this is an ongoing criminal enterprise, not just individual acts of fraud." I sat in Margaret's office reading through sanitized versions of these case files, and with each one I saw my own story reflected back. These were smart, accomplished women who'd done nothing wrong except trust someone they'd loved. A teacher, a small business owner, a nurse, a lawyer, for God's sake. None of them were stupid or careless. They'd all just been targeted by predators who understood exactly how to exploit trust and affection. The call came 3 days later that Derek had been arrested at Denver International Airport, trying to board a flight to Costa Rica. He'd bought a one-way ticket under his own name, which Agent Morris said indicated panic rather than planning. When they searched him, they'd found a laptop, 2 external hard drives, and a passport that turned out to be fraudulent. Margaret and I were called to the FBI field office to review what they'd found, and what I saw on Derek's laptop made me feel physically ill. There were folders for over 20 women, each meticulously organized with financial profiles pulled from public records and social media. Bank balances estimated from property tax records. Instagram photos analyzed for lifestyle markers. Notes on vulnerability factors, recent divorce, widowhood, career success without strong family ties, age over 45. and there was a folder with my name on it dated from 15 years ago, shortly after I'd married David. Agent Morris opened it, and I read Derek's notes with mounting horror. High earning potential, recent inheritance, no children, focused on career advancement. Purchased mountain property, wait for full equity build. Long-term cultivation recommended. Estimate 10-15 years to optimal asset maturity. They'd been planning this before I'd even made my first mortgage payment. David hadn't married me because he loved me. He'd married me because Derek had identified me as a target worth the long game. Every anniversary, every holiday, every moment, I'd thought we were building a life together. It had all been part of a 15-year con waiting for the right moment to execute. "There's more," Agent Brennan said quietly, clicking to another file. This one was labeled with my name and a date, 15 years in the future, 2040 estate planning opportunity. I opened it, and inside was a detailed analysis of what my estate would likely be worth when I reached my late 60s, assuming continued career success and property appreciation. There were notes about probability of inheritance from other family members, estimated retirement account values, and strategies for gaining access through either marriage maintenance or strategic divorce timing. They'd been planning not just for now but for decades into my future, calculating at what point my accumulated wealth would justify whatever strategy they ultimately deployed. Derek's attorney, a public defender who looked exhausted, approached Margaret after we'd finished reviewing the files. "My client is willing to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for sentencing consideration. He'll provide testimony against both Jennifer Walsh and David Walsh regarding the conspiracy to defraud Catherine Walsh, and he'll provide information on the other victims in the pattern." Margaret's expression was ice. "Your client is a predator who spent 25 years helping men steal from vulnerable women. Whatever sentence reduction he gets won't be nearly enough." The attorney nodded tiredly. "I'm aware, but his testimony will ensure the other defendants face significant federal charges. Without him, you might get them on state fraud charges with minimal sentences. With him, you're looking at federal conspiracy, wire fraud, and potentially RICO charges. That's 10 to 20 years instead of 2 to 5. I looked at Margaret, and she looked at me. We both knew the attorney was right. I wanted Derek to pay for every woman he'd helped destroy, but I wanted Jennifer and David to pay too. If Derek's testimony was what it took to bury them both, then that was the deal we'd make. "Tell the prosecutors we'll cooperate," Margaret said, "but Catherine gets to make a victim impact statement at every sentencing hearing, every single one." Derek's lawyer handed over one more file labeled with my name and a date, 15 years in the future, 2040 estate planning opportunity. They'd been planning this before I'd even finished paying off the villa. The package arrived at Margaret's office on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by courier from the estate attorney who'd handled my mother's will 5 years ago. Margaret called me immediately, her voice carrying an odd mixture of curiosity and caution. "Catherine, Stephen Rothman just sent something over. There's a note attached that says it was supposed to be delivered to you only in the event of a legal dispute involving the mountain property. Did you know about this?" I hadn't. I drove to Margaret's office and stared at the small package, a padded envelope containing a USB drive and a handwritten note on my mother's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with her initials embossed at the top. The note was in Stephen's handwriting, not hers. Per the explicit instructions of Elizabeth Walsh, deceased, this recording is to be delivered to Catherine Marie Walsh, only in the event of legal proceedings involving the property at 1247 Mountain Vista Road. Recorded March 2019. March 2019. 6 months before my mother died, when she was already sick, already knowing she was running out of time. I took the drive back to my hotel room at the Brown Palace because I couldn't watch it in Margaret's office, couldn't risk breaking down in a professional setting. I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, my hands shaking slightly as I inserted the drive and clicked on the single file it contained. My mother's face filled the screen, and the shock of seeing her again alive, moving, speaking hit me like a physical blow. She was sitting in her favorite reading chair, the oversized burgundy one that had been in every home we'd lived in throughout my childhood. We'd donated it to Goodwill after she died because neither Jennifer nor I could bear to keep it. She looked thin already, her face more angular than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp and clear and completely focused on the camera. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm but practical, loving, but unsentimental. "If you're watching this, something's gone very wrong. And I'm sorry I can't be there to help you through it. But I can explain some things that might help you understand why I did what I did." She adjusted her position in the chair, wincing slightly, pain she was trying to hide even from a camera. "I need to tell you about your sister. About things I've known for a long time but couldn't fix no matter how hard I tried." Over the next 20 minutes, my mother laid out a history I'd only partially known. She'd discovered Jennifer's gambling problem when Jennifer was 19, finding betting slips and pawn shop receipts hidden in her room. My mother had paid off $8,000 in debts and gotten Jennifer into counseling, which Jennifer had attended for exactly 3 sessions before quitting. At 25, it happened again, $15,000 this time, borrowed from predatory lenders. At 30, Jennifer had maxed out credit cards my mother didn't know existed. At 35, she'd stolen jewelry from my mother's bedroom and sold it. "I tried everything," my mother said, her voice heavy with old grief. "Therapy, financial counseling, tough love, unconditional support. Nothing worked because Jennifer didn't want to change. She wanted what you had, Catherine, your success, your discipline, your life. And she couldn't accept that those things came from work, from choices, from building something slowly over time." My mother explained the structure of her will, the clause that would have given Jennifer the villa if I divorced or died. "I didn't write that clause because I wanted to be fair, sweetheart. I wrote it as a trap. I knew if Jennifer thought she could get the property that way, she'd try. And I needed you to have evidence of her intentions in a legal setting where it would matter. That's why I also made sure you knew about the irrevocable trust option. I told you to protect your assets. I gave you the tools to defend yourself before you even knew you'd need them." The revelation was staggering. My mother had gamed her own will, had set up a situation where Jennifer's greed would expose itself in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. She'd protected me by anticipating exactly what Jennifer would try to do. "I'm leaving you that property not as a gift, but as protection," my mother said, leaning forward slightly toward the camera. "You need something no one can take from you because I won't always be here to protect you myself. Every woman needs that, Catherine. A place that's completely legally, irrevocably hers. I wish I'd had that when I was your age. I wish I'd had something your father couldn't take when he left something that was just mine. But I can give it to you now." Tears were streaming down my face, but I couldn't look away from the screen. My mother was still talking, her voice firm despite her obvious physical weakness. "If your sister is involved in whatever legal trouble you're facing right now, you're probably feeling guilty about protecting yourself. You're probably wondering if you should have done more to help her or if you're being cruel by enforcing your boundaries. Don't. Loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's the last act of love when someone refuses to respect your no." She explained how she'd spent decades trying to help Jennifer build her own life, her own success, funding business ideas that failed, paying for courses Jennifer never completed, creating opportunities Jennifer squandered. But she only ever wanted what belonged to you. She couldn't celebrate your achievements without resenting them. She couldn't build her own life because she was too busy coveting yours. I hope by now she's found peace. I hope she's learned to create instead of take. But if she hasn't, that's not your burden to carry, sweetheart." My mother's face on the screen looked directly at me through time, through death, with that absolute clarity she'd always had about what mattered. "Your only responsibility is to protect what I've given you, which is a place to be safe always. Use the law. Use your intelligence. Use every advantage you have. Don't feel guilty about winning when someone is trying to steal from you. That's not winning, that's surviving. And you deserve to survive, Catherine. You deserve to thrive." The video was winding down now, my mother's energy visibly flagging. "I love you," she said, her voice softer, but no less certain. "I'm proud of who you've become, And I'm sorry I won't be there to see you come through whatever storm brought you to watch this video. But I know you will come through it. You're stronger than you think. You always have been. The screen went dark, and I sat in the silence of my hotel room feeling my mother's presence and protection reaching across death itself. She'd seen all of this coming. She'd known Jennifer would try exactly what she'd tried, and she'd given me the tools to survive it wrapped in a gift that looked like real estate but was actually armor. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark before my phone buzzed with a text from the hotel front desk. A letter had been delivered for me, hand-delivered by courier, no return address. I went downstairs to collect it, and the moment I saw Jennifer's handwriting on the envelope, my stomach dropped. The next morning, I received a handwritten letter from my sister, but what it said made my lawyer advise me to call 911 immediately. I opened the letter standing in the hotel lobby, and the first few lines made my hands go cold. Jennifer's handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places, the pen pressed so hard into the paper it had torn through in spots. Catherine, if I lose everything, if everyone turns against me, I don't see a reason to continue. You've destroyed my life. You've made sure I'll never recover from this humiliation. Sometimes I think ending it would be easier than facing everyone, easier than living with what you've done to me. The letter went on for 3 pages, oscillating wildly between furious accusations and self-pitying despair. She blamed me for ruining her reputation, for turning people against her, for refusing to show mercy or compassion. And woven throughout were references to not wanting to go on, to being better off dead to everyone, finally understanding what I'd done to her once she was gone. I called Margaret immediately, my voice shaking despite my efforts to control it. Jennifer sent me a letter. It's Margaret, I think she's threatening suicide. Read it to me. Margaret said, her tone shifting instantly to professional crisis mode. I read the entire thing while she listened without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Catherine, this could be manipulation, but we have to treat it as a genuine threat. Document the letter, photograph every page, note the time and date you received it. Then I'm calling the police for a wellness check, and I'm hiring a crisis counselor to reach out to her immediately. She's trying to manipulate me, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Probably, but if there's even a 1% chance she's serious, we have to act. And if she's manipulating, having professional documentation of that will protect you legally. The police conducted a wellness check that evening and reported that Jennifer seemed depressed, but not in immediate danger. She'd cried, told them I was destroying her life through false accusations, but hadn't made any explicit threats of self-harm to them. Margaret hired Dr. Rachel Kim, a crisis counselor who specialized in intervention for high-risk individuals. Dr. Kim agreed to visit Jennifer daily for the next 2 weeks and provide regular reports. Those 2 weeks were excruciating. Dr. Kim's reports painted a picture of someone genuinely struggling with depression and anxiety, which I believed Jennifer's entire life was collapsing, her bank accounts frozen, her reputation destroyed, federal charges pending. But there were also troubling details that Dr. Kim flagged in her professional assessments. Jennifer repeatedly mentioned how sorry everyone will be when they realized what they'd driven her to. She talked about finally being understood after she was gone. During one session, she'd asked Dr. Kim detailed questions about medication dosages, how much would make someone sleep deeply but not actually die. And when Dr. Kim had deflected with concern, Jennifer had seemed almost annoyed. My professional opinion, Dr. Kim told me and Margaret in a conference call on day 10, is that Ms. Walsh is experiencing genuine distress, but some of her behavior suggests she's considering what we call a suicidal gesture rather than a genuine suicide attempt. This is an action designed to look like an attempt but calculated to not actually result in death. The goal is typically to generate sympathy, punish someone emotionally, or manipulate a situation. How can you tell the difference? I asked. Genuine suicidal ideation usually involves either impulsive action without planning or careful planning designed to ensure success. What I'm seeing from your sister is something else: performative planning. She researches methods in front of me. She makes sure I know she's thinking about it. She asks questions that suggest she wants a dramatic gesture that people will discover and intervene on, not something that will actually kill her. I felt torn between relief and anger. So she's manipulating the situation. Possibly, but I can't be certain, which is why we continue monitoring. If she does attempt something, we need to be positioned to intervene immediately. The call came at 6 in the morning on day 14. Dr. Kim's voice was steady but urgent. Catherine, I arrived for Jennifer's scheduled check and found her unresponsive. I've called 911. She's breathing but unconscious. There's an empty pill bottle and a note. I met Dr. Kim at St. Joseph's Hospital 40 minutes later, my heart pounding the entire drive. Jennifer had already been admitted and was having her stomach pumped. The emergency room physician, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, explained that Jennifer had taken approximately 30 sleeping pills, a significant dose, but one that hospital staff had seen before in what they called para-suicide attempts. Will she be okay? I asked. Physically, yes. She'll be uncomfortable for a day or two, but there's no permanent damage. The dose was large enough to require intervention, but not large enough to be truly life-threatening if discovered within a reasonable time frame. Dr. Kim handed me a photocopy of the note Jennifer had left, which the police had taken as evidence. The original was dramatic and accusatory. She destroyed me and she didn't care. Tell her I hope she's happy now. Tell her this is what her cruelty caused. Maybe now people will see what kind of person she really is. Over the next 2 days, while Jennifer recovered under psychiatric observation, Dr. Kim compiled her final report with input from the hospital staff and pharmacy records. The toxicology report showed Jennifer had taken exactly 30 pills, not 29, not 31, but precisely 30, suggesting she'd counted carefully. Security footage from the pharmacy where she'd purchased them 3 days earlier showed her asking the pharmacist detailed questions. How many would make someone sleep for a long time? Would 30 be dangerous? Would someone need their stomach pumped? The pharmacist had advised her to follow dosing instructions and offered to speak with her doctor, but Jennifer had declined and made the purchase. Dr. Kim's final assessment was damning in its clinical precision. Based on my observations over 2 weeks and the circumstances of the incident, it is my professional opinion that Ms. Walsh staged this suicide attempt. The dosing was carefully calibrated to require medical intervention without posing genuine mortality risk. Her behavior in our sessions suggested she was planning a gesture rather than a genuine attempt. The note's language is focused on assigning blame and generating sympathy rather than expressing genuine despair. This appears to be a manipulative action designed to shift public and legal perception potentially to make her sister appear responsible for her distress. I sat in Margaret's office reading this report and felt an exhausting mix of emotions. Relief that Jennifer wasn't actually trying to die. Anger that she'd weaponized suicide to manipulate sympathy. Sadness that we'd reached a point where she'd do something this desperate and destructive. And underneath it all, a bone-deep weariness with the entire situation. The court will see this report, Margaret said. It won't help her case. If anything, it makes her look more manipulative, not less. I nodded, too tired to feel anything that resembled victory. I just wanted it to be over. I was sitting in the hospital waiting room late that afternoon, waiting to speak with Jennifer's psychiatric team about her discharge plan when David walked through the automatic doors. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days, and when he saw me, he stopped. For a moment, I thought he was there to see Jennifer to provide some kind of support to his mistress and co-conspirator. But he walked directly toward me, and what he said next made it clear he'd come for something else entirely. Catherine, I need to talk to you. I need to tell you everything. Not because my lawyer thinks it's smart he specifically told me not to do this, but because you deserve to know the truth. As I sat in the hospital waiting room, my husband appeared, but he wasn't there to see his mistress. He was there to confess everything. David looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd last seen him in court. His face was gray and drawn with new lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes. He'd lost weight, his shirt hanging loose on his frame, and there was a defeated slump to his shoulders that I'd never seen in 15 years of marriage. He gestured to the empty chairs in a quiet corner of the waiting room away from the nurse's station and the other visitors. "Can we talk privately? I know I have no right to ask, but I need to tell you some things. Not because my lawyer thinks it's a good idea he specifically told me not to come here, but because you deserve to know the truth." I considered refusing sending him away, maintaining the wall I'd built between us. But something in his voice made me curious. This wasn't the defensive David from the courtroom or the caught husband David from the villa. This was something else, something broken, and maybe finally honest. "We can talk here," I said, gesturing to the chairs but positioning myself so I could see the security desk. "Public space. Say what you need to say." He sat down heavily and for a long moment just stared at his hands. When he finally spoke, the words came out in a rush like he'd been holding them back for weeks and couldn't contain them anymore. "Everything Derek told the FBI is true. All of it. I've been doing this in different forms for 30 years. Your sister isn't the first, and Linda wasn't either. There were others before Linda. I've been a con artist since I was 25 years old, and I've destroyed people, mostly women who trusted me. I've taken their homes, their savings, their sense of safety in the world. And I kept doing it because I'm fundamentally broken in some way I can't fix." I sat very still, watching his face, trying to determine if this was another con or something that might actually be real. "When I met you," he continued, his voice quieter now, "I genuinely intended to stop. You were different from the other marks. You were cautious, skeptical, harder to manipulate. You did background checks. You kept your finances separate. You were smart in ways that should have made you untouchable, and somewhere in that process of trying to figure out how to get past your defenses, I actually fell for you. In my own dysfunctional, broken way, I loved you." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine regret. "For 12 years, I didn't run a single con. I worked my job, I played the role of husband, and part of me believed I'd actually changed. That I'd escaped whatever compulsion had driven me for decades. But then 3 years ago, Derek contacted me. He'd tracked me down, somehow found out about you, about the villa, about your assets. He said this was the score that could set me up for retirement, and something in me just clicked back into the old patterns. "So you used my sister?" I said, my voice flat. "We used each other," he said, and there was a bitter edge to it. "Derek and I identified her as the access point. She was envious of you financially, desperate, morally flexible. We cultivated her, fed her resentment, gave her a plan that made her feel powerful instead of powerless. The affair," he paused, something complicated crossing his face. "The affair became real in ways I didn't expect. Jennifer and I connected over our shared moral bankruptcy. She understood what I was in a way you never could because you're fundamentally decent. We were both predators, and there's a strange intimacy in that recognition." The honesty of it was almost more disturbing than the lies had been. He wasn't trying to make himself sympathetic. He was just stating facts about his own brokenness, like a doctor describing a terminal diagnosis. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I know what I am, Catherine. I've known for years. I lack whatever internal structure most people have that prevents them from hurting others for profit. It's not that I don't understand right from wrong, I understand it perfectly. I just don't feel it the way normal people do. And I kept doing it because it was the only thing I was ever really good at." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the small table between us. "These are divorce papers. Uncontested. You get everything the villa is already legally yours, but you also get all marital assets, all joint accounts, everything. I'm requesting no alimony, no property division, nothing. I'm accepting full financial responsibility for the fraud. I'll cooperate completely with prosecutors." I opened the envelope and scanned the documents. They were exactly as he'd described, a complete capitulation. "I'm going to prison," he said simply. "Probably 3 to 5 years on federal fraud charges. I'll lose my professional licenses, my reputation, any chance at a normal life afterward. But I'm accepting it, Maybe for the first time in my life, I'm facing real consequences instead of talking my way out of them. I looked at him sitting there, this man I'd shared a home with for 15 years, and felt an overwhelming sadness, not for him, but for the waste of it all. The years I'd invested in a marriage that had never been real. The potential for something genuine that had been destroyed by his inability to be honest. The fact that somewhere underneath all the lies and manipulation, there might have been a person worth knowing, but I'd never get to meet him. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you deserved better than you got, and because I want you to understand that none of this was your fault. You didn't miss warning signs because you were naive. You didn't fail to see the truth because you were stupid. I was just very, very good at lying, and I'm sorry for that." I picked up the pen he'd placed on top of the papers and signed my name on the designated lines. The marriage was over. It had never really existed in the first place, but now it was legally finished. "I hope you eventually figure out who you could have been," I said, standing up. "If you'd chosen differently 30 years ago, maybe you could have built something real. But you didn't. And now, you'll have to live with that." He nodded, still sitting, not trying to prolong the conversation. "Thank you for listening. And Catherine, I know it doesn't mean anything, but I'm genuinely sorry." I walked away without responding, leaving him sitting alone in the hospital waiting room. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. 3 days later, the verdicts came back, and the judge's sentence included a detail no one expected. The federal courthouse was packed on the day of sentencing. I sat in the front row beside Margaret Linda on my other side, with at least a dozen other women Derek had victimized scattered throughout the gallery. The air felt heavy with anticipation, with the collective weight of years of betrayal finally about to be acknowledged by the justice system. Derek Morrison was sentenced first. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a federal judge in her late 50s with a reputation for harsh sentences in fraud cases, reviewed the pre-sentencing report with a grim expression. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many predators exploit vulnerable people. "Mr. Morrison, you have been convicted on 8 counts of wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and interstate racketeering. Over a period of 25 years, you targeted vulnerable women, specifically widows and divorcees with significant assets, and systematically defrauded them of their homes, their savings, and their sense of security. The pattern documented by the FBI shows at least 14 confirmed victims with estimated losses exceeding $4.7 million. This court finds your conduct represents a particularly egregious form of predatory behavior that qualifies under federal racketeering statutes." She sentenced Derek to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 10. Additionally, she ordered full restitution of $4.7 million to be divided among the identified victims, including me, Linda, and the other women whose cases had been documented. Asset forfeiture orders would strip Derek of his house, his vehicles, his investment accounts, everything. When the marshals led him away in handcuffs, I felt Linda's hand find mine and squeeze it tight. David was sentenced next in a separate proceeding before Judge Rodriguez, who'd handled the civil case. His cooperation with prosecutors and his guilty plea to 3 counts of fraud and conspiracy had earned him some consideration. Judge Rodriguez acknowledged his full cooperation and what she termed apparent genuine remorse, though she made it clear this didn't excuse his actions. "Mr. Walsh, you have participated in a pattern of financial fraud spanning 30 years. While your cooperation with authorities has been valuable in prosecuting your co-conspirators, the harm you've caused to multiple women cannot be overlooked. You exploited trust, intimacy, and the normal human need for connection to steal from people who loved you." She sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 2 conditioned on continued cooperation and completion of a restitution payment plan. He would lose his professional licenses and face supervised release for 5 years after serving his sentence. When David turned to leave the courtroom, his eyes found mine for just a moment. There was no pleading in them, no attempt at connection. Just a kind of hollow acknowledgement before the marshals escorted him out. Jennifer's sentencing came last, and Judge Rodriguez's expression had hardened noticeably. She'd reviewed Dr. Kim's report about the staged suicide attempt, and it clearly influenced her decision. Ms. Walsh, you have been convicted of securities fraud forgery and conspiracy to commit fraud. But beyond these specific charges, what this court finds most troubling is the pattern of manipulative behavior you've demonstrated throughout these proceedings. The staged suicide attempt, designed to generate sympathy and cast blame on your sister, represents a level of calculated manipulation that suggests a lack of genuine remorse or understanding of the harm you've caused. Jennifer started to speak, but her public defender put a hand on her arm to silence her. This court sentences you to 6 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 3 years. Additionally, you will be required to participate in mandatory financial literacy counseling and gambling addiction treatment both during incarceration and for 5 years following your release. Judge Rodriguez paused, and what came next surprised everyone in the courtroom. Furthermore, upon release, you will perform 2,000 hours of community service specifically focused on educating women about financial fraud and romance scams. Perhaps if you spend enough time warning others about the schemes you perpetrated, you'll develop some understanding of the damage you've caused. It was an unusual sentence, both punitive and potentially rehabilitative. I wasn't sure Jennifer would ever genuinely change, but at least her knowledge would be forced into service protecting others rather than harming them. The civil judgments came 2 weeks later in a separate proceeding. Judge Rodriguez awarded me $800,000 from Jennifer's frozen accounts and future assets, though Margaret warned me we'd likely only collect a fraction of that over many years. David's retirement accounts and future earnings were garnished for $1.2 million, with payments structured to continue throughout his supervised release and beyond. Derek faced a joint judgment for emotional distress that would follow him for the rest of his life, with any income above basic living expenses subject to garnishment. More importantly, the judgments included provisions preventing any of them from profiting from their crimes. Book deals. Movie rights paid interviews. Any compensation received for telling their stories would be immediately seized and distributed to victims. The villa was confirmed permanently and unquestionably as my sole property with the court's written opinion, making it clear that no future legal challenge could succeed. Judge Rodriguez's written opinion was 30 pages long, and Margaret had highlighted several sections for me. One passage in particular struck me. The defendants in this case engaged in a pattern of predatory targeting of successful women, treating the plaintiff not as a person with inherent worth and dignity, but as an asset to be harvested. This court condemns such behavior in the strongest possible terms, and hopes these sentences serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar schemes. I read those words sitting in Margaret's office and felt something shift inside me. The legal system had seen what was done to me, had named it for what it was, and had responded with consequences. It wasn't perfect justice. Jennifer and David would eventually be released. Derek would likely die in prison, but the money he'd stolen was mostly gone. But it was real justice, measured and proportional and documented in legal record. As I walked out of this courthouse that final day, stepping into unexpected October sunshine that warmed my face and made the aspens glow gold against the blue Colorado sky, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Marjorie Chen, the investigative journalist who'd been one of Derek's early victims and who'd helped me understand the scope of his operation. "Catherine," her voice came through clear and purposeful. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, all the women who've been hurt by men like Derek and David. I have a proposition for you. Can we meet?" As I walked out of the courthouse into unexpected sunshine, my phone rang. It was Marjorie, the investigative journalist I'd worked with, and she had a proposition. I met Marjorie 2 days later at the same coffee shop where I'd first met Linda. Marjorie was in her late 50s. A former investigative journalist who'd left the profession after Derek Morrison had defrauded her of nearly $200,000 15 years ago. She'd been one of the women who'd come forward during the FBI investigation, and we'd spoken several times during the proceedings. Now, she sat across from me with a leather portfolio and an intensity that reminded me of myself in my most driven years. "I've been thinking about all of us, she said, spreading documents across the table. All the women Derek and David and men like them have destroyed. Linda, me, you, the dozen others who testified. And I keep coming back to one question: what happens to us after the legal system is finished? We get restitution payments that will trickle in for years and never cover what we lost. We get the satisfaction of seeing them go to prison. But then what? How do we rebuild? She slid a proposal across the table, professionally formatted with a logo at the top, a simple mountain peak with a rising sun. I want to start a nonprofit dedicated to helping women recover from financial fraud perpetrated by romantic partners or family members. Financial counseling to rebuild credit and assets. Legal assistance to navigate restitution and recovery. And most importantly, peer support groups, so victims don't feel alone. I scanned the proposal, impressed by the thoroughness. She'd already identified 14 women from Derek's victim list, willing to participate, had preliminary commitments from 3 financial planners willing to volunteer hours, and had secured interest from 2 therapists who specialized in betrayal trauma. "Why are you bringing this to me?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Because you have resources, experience, and most importantly, you won. Most victims don't. They lose everything and spend decades trying to recover. You protected yourself legally, you fought back effectively, and now you have both money and credibility. You could be what these women need: proof that it's possible to come through this stronger." "I'm exhausted, Marjorie. I'm not sure I can handle reliving this trauma by working with other victims." "I know. But think about this. You're going to be processing what happened to you for years anyway. Wouldn't it be better to do that while helping others than while sitting alone in that villa wondering how you missed the signs?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've talked to Linda. She said the only thing that helped her heal was eventually reaching out to warn other women, turning her pain into protection for others. I think we could do that systematically at scale." The name she'd chosen for the foundation was brilliant in its symbolism: Silver Hope. Reclaiming the name Jennifer had used for her fraudulent fund and transforming it into something that actually helped women instead of exploiting them. I looked at Marjorie's proposal again and felt something shift inside me, a sense that maybe my pain could have purpose, that maybe the villa my mother had left me could be more than just my sanctuary. "Let me think about it," I said, but we both knew I was going to say yes. I used $200,000 from my civil judgment money to seed the foundation, with another $100,000 committed over the next 2 years, as restitution payments came in. Margaret agreed to serve on the board and donate 20 hours per month of legal assistance. I recruited a financial planner I'd worked with for years, a therapist who'd helped me process the betrayal, and Linda, who brought both lived experience and a fierce passion for preventing other women from suffering as she had. The first support group meeting was held on a Saturday afternoon in late spring in the villa's great room, with the windows open to mountain air and wildflowers blooming outside. 15 women arrived, ranging in age from 42 to 79 each, carrying a story of being defrauded by someone they'd trusted. They sat in a circle on the comfortable furniture I'd chosen years ago, and as they went around sharing, I was struck by the devastating commonalities. A woman named Susan, 63, whose second husband had refinanced her home without her knowledge and disappeared with $300,000. A woman named Patricia, 55, whose business partner and lover had embezzled from their shared company. A woman named Grace, 47, whose brother had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit. The tactics were identical: gain trust through relationship exploit, access to finances, disappear when caught. These women weren't careless or naive. They were smart, successful, and careful. But they'd been targeted specifically because predators like Derek and David knew how to bypass defenses by weaponizing love and family bonds. Through the foundation work, I began to understand that I was healing myself as much as helping others. For decades, I'd been so focused on building my career, on accumulating success, on proving myself, that I'd never stopped to ask whether I was happy or truly connected to anyone. My marriage had been empty for years. I'd just been too proud or too busy to admit it. The betrayal, as painful as it was, had forced me to rebuild my life with intention rather than momentum. I started forming real friendships with the women in the support group. Marjorie and I began meeting weekly not just for foundation business, but for coffee, for hikes, for conversations about books and politics and life. Linda became a mentor of sorts, someone who'd walked the path of recovery decades before me and could offer perspective. I opened the villa not as a place to hide from the world, but as a gathering place for women who needed community. We planted a garden on the south side of the house, vegetables and herbs that the support group members tended together and shared in rotating harvest baskets. I started writing about my experience not for publication or profit, but for catharsis, putting words to things I'd never fully processed. When I shared some of what I'd written in the support group, other women asked for copies. I posted some essays anonymously online, and messages started arriving. "This happened to me too. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for making me feel less alone." For the first time in decades, I felt like I was living rather than just achieving. The villa stopped being a monument to my success and became something better. A place where women rebuilt their lives together, where pain was transformed into protection for others, where my mother's gift of safety was multiplied and shared. 6 months after the foundation launched, I received a letter from the Federal Correctional Institution in Littleton, where Jennifer was serving her sentence. The handwriting was different than I remembered, smaller, more controlled, less frantic. "Catherine, I've been in the financial literacy and gambling addiction program here. They're making me write letters to the people I've hurt, really examine what I did and why. I'd like to meet face to face if you're willing. I think I finally understand something you've been trying to tell me for 50 years. I stared at Jennifer's letter for 2 weeks, reading it repeatedly, trying to determine if the words were genuine or just another manipulation. Margaret's advice was unequivocal when I showed it to her. "You don't owe her anything, Catherine. Not your time, not your emotional energy, and certainly not forgiveness. She destroyed your marriage, tried to steal your home, and staged a suicide attempt to make you look like the villain. Why would you give her the satisfaction of a visit?" But Linda, when I called her, offered a different perspective. Sometimes people do change, especially when they're finally facing real consequences. I'm not saying you should forgive her or reconcile with her, but if you don't go, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if she might have been genuine. At least if you go, you'll know. I decided to visit, but I spent days preparing myself emotionally. I wasn't going to forgive. I wasn't going to reconcile. I wasn't going to provide emotional support or maternal comfort. I was going to listen, evaluate whether Jennifer had genuinely changed, and make decisions about boundaries based on what I observed. Nothing more. The Federal Correctional Institution in Littleton was exactly as grim as I'd expected. Razor wire topped the fence's guard towers, stood at each corner, and the building itself was all cinder block and reinforced glass. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner fought a losing battle against the underlying odor of too many people living in too small a space. I went through security, emptying my pockets, removing my jewelry, being scanned and patted down, and then waited in a visitation room with harsh fluorescent lighting and furniture bolted to the floor. Jennifer was escorted in by a guard, and I barely recognized her. She'd lost at least 20 pounds, her face angular and tired. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing an orange jumpsuit that somehow made her look both younger and older at the same time. She sat down across from me at the small table, and for several minutes, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other across the physical and emotional distance that had grown between us. "Thank you for coming," she finally said, her voice quiet and stripped of the bravado I'd always associated with her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't." She nodded, accepting that. "I've been in the mandatory programs here: financial literacy, gambling addiction therapy, fraud prevention, education. They're making me face things I've avoided my whole life." She paused, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "The therapist made me do an exercise. I had to write down every significant lie I've told for the past 30 years. Every manipulation, every time I took something that wasn't mine, every person I hurt. It took 4 notebooks." I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of performance, but what I saw looked like genuine exhaustion mixed with something that might have been shame. She helped me understand something I never wanted to admit, Jennifer continued. That my whole life has been defined by envy of you. When we were kids, you were the one who got praised for grades. You were the one Mom showed off to her friends. You were the one who seemed to succeed at everything without even trying. And I internalized this belief that success was finite, that there was only so much to go around, and every win you had was a loss for me. Her voice was steady but raw, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed, but that cost her something to say aloud. So instead of building my own life, my own achievements, my own identity, I spent decades trying to take pieces of yours. Your money, your husband, your property, your reputation. I treated you like an obstacle to overcome instead of a sister to love, and I destroyed both of us in the process. She looked up at me then, and I saw tears forming in her eyes, but not yet falling. I know this doesn't fix anything. I know you probably hate me, and you should. I've earned that. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I did wrong. Not just legally, morally. I treated you like you were the enemy when you were the person who helped me most consistently throughout my entire life. I sat with her words for a long moment, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions they evoked. Anger that it had taken prison and court-ordered therapy for her to reach this understanding. Sadness for the relationship we could have had if she'd been capable of this honesty decades ago. And underneath it all, a deep weariness with the entire situation. I appreciate that you're working on yourself, I said, my voice measured and deliberate. I genuinely hope you continue with the therapy and the programs, because the alternative is you get out in 6 years and you do this again to someone else. But I need you to understand something very clearly. I don't forgive you. I might someday, I honestly don't know, but that's not where I am now. And even if I eventually do forgive you, we're not going to be sisters again in any meaningful way. You broke something between us that can't be fully repaired. Jennifer nodded, and now the tears did fall, sliding down her cheeks silently. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I'm trying to be different. I stood up to leave, signaling the guard that our visit was ending. But before I walked away, I added one more thing, something I'd been debating saying throughout the entire conversation. When you get out, if you genuinely want to rebuild your life without hurting people, I'll help connect you with resources, job training programs, housing assistance, addiction support groups. But we won't have a personal relationship. You'll be someone I once knew who I'm helping from a distance. That's the boundary I can offer. She looked up at me, her face blotchy from crying, and managed a small nod. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. I walked out of that prison into the bright Colorado afternoon, and as I drove back toward Denver, I realized something had shifted inside me. The visit hadn't given me closure exactly, but it had given me clarity. Jennifer might genuinely be changing, or she might just be performing rehabilitation to make parole easier. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility to save her, or fix her, or maintain hope for a reconciliation that might never be healthy. What I was responsible for was my own healing, my own boundaries, my own future. As I drove away from the prison, I realized I was finally ready to do something I'd been avoiding for months: return to the villa and decide if I wanted to keep it or let it go. I'd been avoiding the villa for 6 months, living out of the Brown Palace, and then in a borrowed condo from a colleague who was working overseas. Every time I thought about returning, my stomach would clench with the memory of that afternoon, the scattered clothing, the wine glasses, Jennifer in my robe. The space that was supposed to be my sanctuary had become the site of my greatest betrayal, and I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe there again. But driving away from the prison after seeing Jennifer, something shifted. I realized I'd been giving her and David too much power by letting them drive me away from something my mother had specifically chosen to protect me. This property wasn't theirs to taint. It was mine, built with my mother's legacy, and I wasn't going to let two people's terrible choices steal that from me. I drove up the mountain on a Saturday morning in late October, the aspens at their peak gold, the air sharp and clean in that way that only happens at high altitude in autumn. When I reached the gate and punched in the code, my hands were shaking. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the house through the windshield, waiting for the panic attack I was sure would come. It didn't come. Instead, as I finally walked to the front door and stepped inside, I felt something unexpected possibility. The house was exactly as I'd left it that day. Margaret had arranged for a cleaning service to come through once, but nothing had been changed or moved. The furniture I'd chosen, the art I'd collected, the books I'd arranged on custom shelves. Yes, terrible things had happened here. But this was also the manifestation of 27 years of work, the proof that I'd succeeded, the tangible form of my mother's love and protection. I walked through every room, touching the walls, opening windows to let in mountain air. In the master bedroom, I stood at the window looking out at the view I'd designed, the entire house around 50 miles of peaks and valleys, endless sky, the kind of perspective that made human problems seem smaller. I decided then I was keeping this place, but I was transforming it into something new. I hired a renovation company to do a complete refresh. New paint throughout in warmer tones than the cool grays I'd originally chosen. New furniture in the guest bedroom where Jennifer had stayed. Refinished hardwood floors in the great room. But I made one specific request that the contractor found odd. I wanted them to leave certain imperfections. The scratch on the floor near the entryway where Jennifer's suitcase had dragged. The faint wine stain on the deck boards that no amount of sanding could completely remove. A small dent in the drywall where David had bumped it with a chair. I kept these marks not to wallow in the pain, but as reminders. Bad things had happened in this house, and I had survived them. The scars were part of the story, now evidence of both violation and resilience. When the renovation was nearly complete, I invited Marjorie, Linda, and 4 women from the Silver Hope support group to join me for what I called a reclaiming ceremony. I wasn't sure what the ceremony would look like. I'd never done anything like this before, but it felt important to mark the transition from violated space to renewed sanctuary. We gathered on a Sunday afternoon, and I asked each woman to walk through the house with me and share a story of reclaiming something after trauma. Linda talked about rebuilding her credit score from 480 to 720 over 10 years, each point a small victory. Marjorie described the moment she'd finally been able to look at her bank statements without panic attacks. A woman named Susan shared how she'd reclaimed her maiden name after her ex-husband had used their shared last name to commit fraud. Another woman, Grace, talked about the day she'd finally thrown away the clothes she'd worn the last time she saw the man who'd stolen from her, choosing to replace them with an entirely new wardrobe she'd bought with her first paycheck after bankruptcy. We burned sage that Marjorie had brought, walking through each room and letting the smoke drift through open windows. None of us were particularly spiritual, but the ritual felt significant, a physical acknowledgement that we were cleansing this space of its painful history. We planted 3 aspen saplings on the south side of the property, young trees that would grow as we grew, transforming alongside us. By sunset, we gathered on the deck for a meal I'd catered from a restaurant in town. Nothing fancy, just good food shared among women who understood each other's pain. As we ate and talked and laughed, the villa felt fundamentally different. Not erased of its history, but transformed by our collective presence and intention. That evening, I made a decision about the villa's future purpose. It would become the site of quarterly Silver Hope retreats, long weekends, where women recovering from financial fraud could come stay, rest, and heal together. We'd offer financial planning workshops, therapy sessions, legal consultations, and simply space to breathe away from the stress of their regular lives. The first retreat happened 6 weeks later. 12 women arrived on a Friday afternoon in early December, most of them nervous, all of them carrying visible exhaustion. Over 3 days, we created a container of safety and support. Morning workshops on credit repair and asset protection. Afternoon therapy sessions with trauma specialists. Evening communal dinners where we shared stories and strategies. We hiked the trails around the property, bundled in winter coats, our breath visible in the cold air. We sat by the fireplace I'd designed to be large enough to gather around, sipping tea and wine and hot chocolate. I watched these women arrive carrying shame, the particular shame that comes from being defrauded by someone you loved. The internalized belief that somehow you should have known, should have seen the signs, should have protected yourself better. And I watched them leave 3 days later carrying something lighter. Not healed completely, that would take years, but healing. Connected to other women who understood, armed with practical tools and knowledge. Reminded that they were intelligent, capable people who'd been targeted by skilled predators, not fools who'd made stupid choices. On the last night, a woman named Patricia, 58, a former healthcare executive who'd been defrauded by her business partner and lover, found me while I was cleaning up after dinner. "Catherine, I need to tell you something. I thought after what happened to me, I'd never feel safe anywhere again. I thought the ability to trust a space to relax was just gone. But here in your home, I felt safe. Thank you for that." Her words crystallized what I'd been struggling to articulate. This was exactly what my mother had wanted, not just a place where I could be safe, but a place that could offer safety to any woman who needed it. On the last night of the retreat, as I locked up the villa after everyone had left, I found an envelope that had been slipped under the door. Inside was $100 in cash, and a note in my sister's handwriting, 1 of 500. "I'm starting to pay back what I owe." I stared at the envelope and the $100 in cash for a long time that night, sitting alone in the villa after everyone had left. The note was simple, just 1 of 500 in Jennifer's handwriting, but the implications were staggering. She was planning to make 500 payments. At $100 each, that would be $50,000, which wouldn't even begin to cover the actual damages she'd caused, but that clearly wasn't the point. The point was consistency, accountability, action over time. The payments continued to arrive every 2 weeks like clockwork. Sometimes $50, sometimes $100, occasionally as little as $25. Each envelope bore the prison's return address and contained a brief note, 2 of 500, 3 of 500, 4 of 500. I didn't cash them at first. I let them accumulate in a drawer in my desk at the villa, uncertain how I felt about accepting money from my sister's prison wages. It felt too much like forgiveness, and I wasn't ready for that. Margaret and I discussed it over coffee one morning. "Accepting restitution isn't the same as forgiving," she said, stirring sugar into her cup with methodical precision. "And honestly, Jennifer probably needs to make these payments more than you need to receive them. It's her way of taking concrete action, of proving to herself that she's changing. If you refuse them, you might actually be taking away one of the few meaningful things she can do to make amends." That perspective shifted something for me. This wasn't about me accepting her apology or welcoming her back into my life. This was about allowing her to take responsibility in the only way currently available to her. Along with the payments, letters began arriving. Not frequently, maybe one every few weeks, but regular enough that a picture emerged of Jennifer's life inside the Federal Correctional Institution. She wrote in a plain, unadorned style that was nothing like her old dramatic flair. She'd completed the mandatory gambling addiction program and had been asked to serve as a peer facilitator, helping other inmates recognize and address their own addictive behaviors. She was taking community college courses through a prison education program, working toward an associate degree in social work, with a focus on financial counseling. One letter described her participation in a restorative justice program, where inmates wrote detailed letters to their victims, not asking for forgiveness, but taking full accountability for specific harms they'd caused. Jennifer had written letters to the 14 women from the Silver Echo investor list, explaining exactly how she'd planned to defraud them and apologizing for the violation of trust. Several of the women had written back not to forgive, but to tell her how her attempt had affected them. Jennifer wrote that reading those responses had been more painful than anything the judge had said during sentencing because they made the harm real and personal rather than abstract. Most significantly, she'd provided the FBI with detailed information about Derek Morrison's broader criminal network names of other men he'd worked with, patterns she'd observed, financial structures he'd taught her. Her information had led to the identification and charging of 3 additional men involved in romance scams across multiple states. She wasn't doing this for leniency or early release. She was doing it because, as she wrote, "If I know how these schemes work and I don't help stop them, then I'm still complicit. Linda had started corresponding with Jennifer, something she'd mentioned to me casually one afternoon at the villa. I'm not saying you need to forgive her or have a relationship with her, Linda said, her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea. But I think she's genuinely changing, Catherine. I've seen a lot of people in my life make promises to change and not follow through. Jennifer is following through. That's rare enough that it's worth acknowledging even if you never want to see her again. After 6 months and 12 payments, I finally responded. I kept my letter brief and factual, avoiding emotional language that might be misinterpreted as warmth or reconciliation. Jennifer, I've been depositing your payments into the Silver Hope Foundation's general fund. The money is being used to help other victims of financial fraud for counseling, legal assistance, and emergency financial support. Your restitution is being transformed into prevention and healing for women who've been hurt the way you hurt people. That feels right to both of us, I think. Her response came 3 weeks later, equally brief. That's better than I deserve. Thank you for doing something good with it. I'll keep sending what I can. We weren't rebuilding a sister relationship. We weren't moving toward reconciliation or family dinners or shared holidays. What we were establishing was something more honest and possibly more sustainable. 2 women who shared DNA and history, but weren't close, who'd hurt and been hurt by each other, but were both actively trying to be better people going forward. It wasn't a Hollywood ending with tearful hugs and forgiveness. It was realistic, boundaried, and rooted in action rather than sentiment. I found myself thinking about Jennifer differently as the months passed. Not with warmth or trust, but with a kind of clinical acknowledgement that people could change, even people who'd done terrible things. She'd spent 50 years making destructive choices, and now she was making different ones. That didn't erase the past or obligate me to welcome her back into my life, but it was worth noting. I realized I didn't need Jennifer to grovel or self-flagellate or perform elaborate demonstrations of remorse. I just needed her to stop causing harm. And if she could eventually start causing good, helping other women avoid the mistakes she'd made using her knowledge of fraud to protect instead of exploit, that would be even better. Not for her redemption, but for the world's protection. The payment marked 26 of 500 arrived on a Tuesday in late spring. I deposited it into the Silver Hope account without ceremony, watching the balance increase by $75. That money would help pay for a therapy session, or contribute to a legal consultation, or provide an emergency fund payment to a woman fleeing a financially abusive situation. Jennifer's harm was being slowly and incompletely transformed into help. I was filing the deposit receipt when another envelope arrived, this one with a return address I didn't recognize, Scottsdale, Arizona. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, neat, and precise. When I opened it, the letter inside began, Ms. Walsh, my name is Claire Henderson. I was married to Derek Morrison 15 years ago from 2008 to 2011. I've been following the news coverage of his conviction, and there are things you need to know, things that might change his case. Then came the letter that changed everything, not from my sister or husband, but from a woman named Claire, who'd been married to Derek Morrison 15 years ago, and had evidence that could reopen his case. Claire's letter was 10 pages long, typed single-spaced with an attached USB drive containing what she called evidence I've kept for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. I called Margaret immediately, and we spent the next 3 days reviewing everything Claire had sent. The files were meticulous emails between Derek and various associates discussing prospects and targets, financial records showing money moving through shell companies, and most damning recorded phone calls Claire had made during her divorce when she'd been trying to prove Derek's infidelity, and discovered something much worse. Claire herself flew to Denver a week later, and we met in Margaret's office on a gray afternoon in June. She was 63 now, a small woman with silver hair and the cautious bearing of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. She'd been a financial analyst before marrying Derek, which explained both why he'd targeted her and why she'd eventually figured out what he was doing. I suspected for over a year before I had proof, she said, spreading documents across Margaret's conference table. He was careful, always had explanations for things that seemed off, But I'm good with numbers and patterns, and eventually I saw it. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was running multiple financial schemes simultaneously. Romance scams, mortgage fraud, identity theft. I gathered everything I could, filed for divorce, and got out. But I could never fully prove the criminal activity, so he walked away with a slap on the wrist and moved on to his next victim. The files Claire had kept documented Derek's activities from 2008 to 2011, filling in gaps the FBI had never been able to close. More importantly, they established a continuous pattern of criminal enterprise spanning decades, which meant that statutes of limitations might not apply in the same way. Margaret immediately contacted the federal prosecutors, and within 2 weeks, they'd reopened Derek's case to consider additional charges. Working with Claire's evidence and renewed FBI investigation, they identified 11 more victims spanning from 1995 to 2010. Some of the women had died too from stress-related heart attacks within years of being defrauded, which felt like its own form of murder. But their adult children came forward to testify about what the fraud had done to their mothers. 7 of the women were still alive, and when the prosecutors reached out, all 7 agreed to participate in the expanded case. I attended some of the victim interviews at Margaret's request, sitting quietly in the back of conference rooms, while women told stories that could have been my own. A real estate broker from Phoenix, who'd been defrauded of $200,000 by a man she'd planned to marry, a man who'd disappeared the day before their wedding. A teacher from Seattle who'd refinanced her home to help her boyfriend's failing business, only to discover the business never existed. A nurse from Atlanta who'd lost her entire retirement account to an investment scheme remarkably similar to Silver Echo. The pattern was depressingly consistent across 3 decades. Identify successful women over 45 with assets, use romance to bypass their defenses, create manufactured financial crises, extract money through fraud or manipulation, then disappear. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit estimated that Derek and his network had defrauded victims of at least $12 million over 30 years, though they suspected the real number was higher. With this expanded evidence, prosecutors brought additional federal racketeering charges under RICO statutes. The hearing was scheduled for September, giving us 3 months to prepare. Margaret proposed something ambitious, a class-action civil suit not just against Derek, but against the entire infrastructure that had enabled his crimes. The banks that had processed obviously fraudulent wire transfers without adequate scrutiny. The real estate companies that had facilitated property transfers with forged documents. The title companies that had failed to verify signatures. It was a long shot. Most of these entities had legal protections and deep pockets for defense. But Margaret found a firm in Chicago that specialized in complex fraud cases and was willing to take it on contingency. Meanwhile, I worked with the Silver Hope Board to create a dedicated restitution fund for Derek's victims who couldn't afford to pursue legal action or who'd been told their cases were too old to prosecute. I contributed $200,000 from my own civil judgment funds, and through fundraising and matching donations from supporters who'd been following the case, we raised another $300,000. The fund would provide grants ranging from $5,000 to $25,000 to help with immediate needs, legal fees for reopening cases, credit repair services, emergency housing deposits for women who'd lost their homes, therapy costs for trauma treatment. We organized a gathering at the villa in August, inviting every victim we could locate. 30 women came ranging in age from 48 to 82, representing 3 decades of Derek's predation. We spent a weekend together sharing stories, connecting across our shared experiences, and drafting a collective victim impact statement to be read at Derek's resentencing hearing. The statement took hours to craft, with each woman contributing paragraphs about what had been taken from them. Not just money, but security, trust, years of their lives spent rebuilding what Derek had destroyed. Some women had never remarried. Some had declared bankruptcy. Some had lost relationships with family members who blamed them for being stupid enough to fall for a con. All of them carried shame they didn't deserve internalized from a society that insisted smart women should have known better. At the end of the weekend, when the statement was complete, the group asked me to read it at the hearing. I was hesitant. My own experience was recent compared to what some of these women had endured. But Linda, who'd become something of an elder stateswoman among Derek's victims, squeezed my hand and said, "You have a voice that carries authority. Use it for those of us who've spent years not being heard." The resentencing hearing was scheduled for September 15th in federal court. Margaret and I arrived early, and I watched as the courtroom filled with victims and their supporters, journalists covering the expanded case, and federal prosecutors armed with 3 decades of evidence. Derek was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, and he looked older than his 58 years, his face gray and drawn. Judge Hendricks reviewed the new evidence with the same grim expression she'd worn at the original sentencing. When she asked if there were victim impact statements, the lead prosecutor indicated that there was a collective statement representing 42 victims spanning 3 decades. The judge nodded and asked me to approach the podium. I held the statement 15 pages representing the collective pain of 42 women and began to read. Standing before the judge at Derek's resentencing, I held statements from 42 women spanning 3 decades, and when I began reading, even the bailiff was crying. My voice was steady when I began reading from the first page of the collective statement. Your Honor. These words represent 42 women spanning 3 decades. We speak with one voice today, because our experiences, though separated by years and geography, are essentially identical. Derek Morrison didn't just steal our money, he stole our sense of safety in the world. I read Linda's words first, giving her the position of honor as the earliest victim willing to speak publicly. He made me feel like I'd finally found safety after my husband died, then he systematically took the home my husband had provided for our family. I was 48 years old, and found myself starting over with nothing but debt and shame. The courtroom was completely silent except for my voice. I could see Derek sitting at the defense table, his face carefully blank, refusing to look at me or any of the women in the gallery. I continued reading, moving through the statement page by page, each paragraph representing a different woman's pain. A woman named Margaret, no relation to my attorney, who'd lost her retirement savings at 67 and had to move in with her daughter, giving up her independence and becoming a burden to her own child in her final years. A woman named Sarah, who'd been defrauded at 52 and had spent the next decade rebuilding her credit while working 2 jobs, missing her children's graduations and weddings because she couldn't afford time off. A woman named Patricia, whose marriage had fallen apart after the fraud because her husband blamed her for being stupid enough to trust Derek's associate. I read my own words describing the moment I'd walked into my villa and seen the evidence of betrayal scattered across my sanctuary. He didn't just steal my property. He stole my marriage, my trust, my belief that the home my mother left me would always be safe. Claire's statement came near the end, her words particularly powerful because she'd been the one with the foresight to gather evidence, but the misfortune to be ahead of her time. I knew what he was. I tried to stop him 15 years ago. And I've lived with the knowledge that my failure to prove it then meant he continued destroying lives for another 15 years. That guilt belongs to him, not to me, but I've carried it anyway. With each paragraph, I watched the cumulative weight of harm register on Judge Hendricks's face. These weren't abstract financial crimes. These were intimate betrayals that had weaponized love, trust, and normal human vulnerability. By the time I reached the final page, my voice was shaking despite my efforts to control it. I could see several people in the gallery crying openly, journalists, victim advocates, even the court reporter had tears streaming down her face. We ask this court to recognize, I read from the closing paragraph we'd crafted together, that Derek Morrison didn't commit 42 separate crimes. He committed one crime 42 times, the crime of treating vulnerable women as resources to be extracted, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. We ask that his sentence reflect not just the monetary damage, but the decades of trauma he caused to women who did nothing wrong except trust someone who presented himself as trustworthy. I returned to my seat beside Margaret, my hands trembling now that the reading was finished. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, and when we returned, Derek's attorney stood to make a statement. Derek himself was given the opportunity to speak, and what came out was exactly the kind of hollow performance his lawyer had probably coached him to deliver. "I apologize for the pain I caused," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "I take full responsibility for my actions." No specifics, no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of his crimes, no recognition of individual women or the particular harms he'd caused each of them. Just the minimum words required to demonstrate remorse for the record. Judge Hendricks saw through it immediately. When she spoke, her voice carried a cold fury that silenced the entire courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, you have spent 30 years of your life treating vulnerable women as resources to be extracted and exploited. The evidence shows you targeted them specifically because of their age, their assets, and their emotional vulnerability. You weaponized intimacy and trust in service of theft. And now, facing the consequences of those choices, you offer hollow words about taking responsibility while demonstrating no genuine understanding of the harm you've caused." She paused, letting her words settle. "This court finds that your previous sentence of 12 years was insufficient, given the scope and duration of your criminal enterprise. I am adding 8 additional years to your sentence for a total of 20 years in federal prison. You will be 73 years old before you are eligible for parole. Additionally, I am ordering full financial disclosure of any assets held in others' names and directing the U.S. Marshals Service to seize and liquidate any property accounts or holdings for distribution to your victims as restitution." Derek's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench on the table in front of him. 20 years. He would likely die in prison or emerge as an old man with nothing and nowhere to go. After the hearing concluded, the women who'd attended gathered on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sunshine. Someone had brought champagne cheap from a grocery store plastic cups, and all but it didn't matter. We weren't celebrating revenge. We were celebrating survival resilience, the refusal to let these crimes define the rest of our lives. Linda raised her cup first. "To all of us," she said simply. Still standing. We echoed her words, and I looked around at these faces, women of different races, backgrounds, professions, ages, spanning nearly 4 decades, all connected by trauma but choosing right now to connect through strength instead. Claire stood beside Linda, 2 women from different eras of Derek's crimes, talking quietly about the relief of finally being heard. Marjorie was laughing with a group of younger victims, sharing advice about credit repair. "We should formalize this," Marjorie said, turning to address the whole group. "Make this survivor network an official part of Silver Hope, a survivor advisory board that guides the foundation's work and mentors new victims who come forward. We have collective wisdom that shouldn't be wasted." The agreement was immediate and unanimous. We exchanged contact information, made plans for a retreat at the villa, talked about creating a private online forum where we could support each other between meetings. Someone suggested we take a photo, and we arranged ourselves on the courthouse steps, 30 women ranging in age from 45 to 81. Some smiling, some crying, all present and accounted for. We weren't smiling because everything was okay. We were smiling because we were still here, still fighting, still refusing to be erased by what had been done to us. As we left the courthouse, walking toward the parking structure in small groups, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced at the screen and stopped walking. "Thank you for not giving up. I'm victim number 43, and I'm ready to come forward." Victim number 43 was a woman named Rachel, 56 years old, who'd been defrauded by one of Derek's associates in 2012. She'd seen the news coverage of the resentencing and had finally found the courage to come forward with her story. Margaret and I met with her the following week, and within a month she'd joined our survivor advisory board and was helping us identify patterns we'd missed in Derek's network. Her participation led to 2 more victims coming forward, then 3 more after that. The ripple effect seemed endless. Over the next year, Silver Hope grew into something I'd never imagined when Marjorie first proposed it. We hired a small staff, an executive director, a victim advocate, and an administrative coordinator. Our volunteer network expanded to include 37 lawyers providing pro bono assistance and 22 financial advisors offering free consultations. We established formal partnerships with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and several state attorney general offices, creating a rapid response system to provide immediate support to fraud victims while evidence was still fresh. The numbers told part of the story. We'd helped 127 women recover an average of $18,000 each through a combination of restitution claims, civil judgments, and negotiated settlements. But the numbers didn't capture the full impact: the woman who finally stopped having panic attacks when checking her bank balance, the grandmother who could afford to visit her grandchildren again, the professional who rebuilt her credit enough to rent an apartment after years of couch surfing. We'd also moved beyond individual casework into systemic advocacy. Margaret led an effort to lobby for state legislation requiring banks to flag suspicious wire transfers involving elderly or vulnerable customers. After 18 months of committee hearings and negotiations, the law passed. It wouldn't prevent all fraud, but it would create one more barrier between predators and their targets. I'd become a reluctant advocate, testifying before legislative committees and speaking at conferences about financial abuse. The work was exhausting in ways my corporate career had never been. Every testimony meant reliving aspects of my own betrayal. Every conference panel meant facing rooms full of people who looked at me with pity or curiosity, or that particular kind of voyeuristic interest people have in other people's disasters. But it was meaningful in ways that closing real estate deals had never been. I was using my business skills not to accumulate wealth, but to distribute justice, and that shift felt profoundly right. My personal life had transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. 6 months after the resentencing, I'd started dating someone, a development that surprised me as much as anyone. Her name was Anna, a 54-year-old architect I'd met through the foundation. She'd been defrauded by a business partner years ago and had attended one of our workshops. We'd started as friends, then slowly, carefully, something more had developed. It was nothing like my marriage to David. There was no rush, no intensity, no feeling of being swept away. Instead, there was patience, honesty, and the kind of careful negotiation that happens between two people who've both been burned and are determined not to repeat their mistakes. We'd been seeing each other for months before she even came to the villa, and when she did, I'd been nervous in a way I hadn't expected. But she'd walked through the space with professional appreciation for the architecture and personal understanding of what it meant to reclaim a place where you'd been hurt. I'd also rebuilt relationships with friends I'd neglected during my marriage, college roommates, former colleagues, women. I'd allowed to drift away because David had subtly discouraged those friendships. I started hosting monthly dinners at the villa gatherings where we explicitly didn't talk about trauma or fraud or any of the heavy things that consumed so much of my working life. We cooked together, played board games, watched old movies, and just existed in each other's company without agenda or purpose beyond connection. My therapist, Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, noted the change during one of our sessions. "You've stopped defining yourself primarily through achievement," she said. "You're building an identity based on relationships and community rather than just professional success. That's significant growth." She was right, though the change wasn't complete. I still struggled with trust, still found myself analyzing people's motives and looking for hidden agendas. I still had nightmares sometimes where I walked into the villa and found evidence of new betrayals. But the nightmares were less frequent, and I was learning to recognize them as echoes of old trauma rather than predictions of new danger. Jennifer had now served 2 years of her 6-year sentence. She'd been accepted into a prison-to-work early release program that would allow her to serve her final year in a halfway house if she maintained good behavior and completed additional rehabilitative requirements. Her letters had mentioned that she'd started a blog through the prison's approved communication system, writing about financial fraud from the perpetrator's perspective. I'd been skeptical at first, assuming it would be self-serving or manipulative, but curiosity had eventually won out. The blog was surprisingly insightful. Jennifer wrote with clinical precision about the psychology of fraud, how perpetrators identified and exploited vulnerabilities, the justifications they used to silence their own consciences. Law enforcement officers had started citing it in training materials. Victim advocates used excerpts in their educational programs. She was taking her knowledge of how to harm people and transforming it into knowledge of how to protect them. We exchanged letters every few months now, a correspondence that was businesslike but not hostile. She reported on her progress courses, completed therapy sessions, attended volunteer work in the prison library. I responded with brief updates about Silver Hope's work, sometimes including information about legislative victories or victims who'd been helped by the foundation. We weren't rebuilding a sister relationship, but we were establishing something, a recognition of shared history and separate futures. Her most recent letter had included a request that I'd been sitting with for weeks. She was coming up for her parole board review in 6 months, and she'd asked if I would consider writing a letter of support. Not asking for my forgiveness or for me to minimize what she'd done, but simply confirming that she'd been making genuine efforts toward rehabilitation. I hadn't decided yet whether I would. I wasn't obligated to help her, and part of me wanted to let her face the parole board without my support. But another part of me recognized that if redemption was going to be possible for people who genuinely did the work, I might need to be willing to acknowledge when that work was happening. On the 2-year anniversary of the day I discovered the affair, I decided to do something I'd been planning for months, turn the villa into something permanent. The legal paperwork to transfer the villa to Silver Hope Foundation took Margaret 3 months to complete. The structure we'd chosen was complex. A conservation easement combined with a life estate that would allow me to live there as long as I served as executive director, while ensuring the property could never be sold or used for anything other than its intended purpose of supporting women recovering from financial abuse. On the day we signed the final documents in Margaret's office, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. This place that was supposed to be my private sanctuary had become a shared sanctuary for dozens of women. What my mother had given me, I was now giving to others. It felt like the completion of a circle. She'd protected me with property, and now I was protecting others the same way. We decided to mark the transition with a celebration, nothing formal or fundraising focused, just a gathering of the people who'd been part of this journey. Over 60 people came to the villa on a Saturday in late September, exactly 2 years and 1 week after the afternoon I'd discovered the affair. The women from Silver Hope were there, both staff and the Survivor Advisory Board. Margaret brought her wife and teenage daughter. Linda arrived looking vibrant at 72, still sharp and passionate about the work we were doing. Marjorie came with her adult son who'd supported her through her own recovery years ago. Former victims from Derek's cases drove in from neighboring states. Even Dr. Kim attended the crisis counselor who'd monitored Jennifer during those tense weeks 2 years ago. David was not there. He was 18 months into his 4-year sentence, and we hadn't spoken since the day he'd confessed in the hospital waiting room. I'd received 1 letter from him 6 months ago, brief and matter-of-fact, informing me that he was participating in a prison therapy program and hoped I was well. I hadn't responded. That chapter of my life was closed. Jennifer had sent a letter that arrived the morning of the celebration. I'd opened it alone in the kitchen before guests arrived, unsure what to expect. It was surprisingly appropriate, congratulating me on the work I was doing with Silver Hope, acknowledging that she understood why she would never be invited to gatherings like this, expressing hope that the villa would help many women in the years to come. There was no self-pity, no manipulation, just a recognition of reality and boundaries. I'd folded it back into its envelope and tucked it into my desk drawer, a small acknowledgement received and noted, but not requiring response. As the afternoon progressed into evening, I found myself standing on the deck watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Anna appeared beside me with 2 glasses of wine, handing me one without speaking. We stood together in comfortable silence, her shoulder touching mine, watching the light change. Below us, I could hear laughter from the great room where a group was playing charades with the enthusiasm of people who'd known real darkness and chosen joy anyway. "You've built something remarkable here," Anna said quietly. "Your mother would be proud." I thought about that, about my mother's video message, her foresight in protecting me, her understanding that I'd need this place to be untouchable. She couldn't have known the specific betrayals I'd face, but she'd known I'd face something, and she'd given me the tools to survive it. I'm not the same person who drove up this road 2 years ago. I said the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. That woman was successful but so lonely, protected but isolated, strong but brittle. I think I would have eventually broken even without the affair because I was building a life that looked impressive from the outside, but felt hollow inside. Anna nodded, understanding in the way only someone who'd walked a similar path could understand. Sometimes betrayal is the thing that forces us to rebuild more honestly. It's a terrible gift, but it's still a gift. Late that night, after everyone had left and the villa was quiet again, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of chamomile tea and opened my laptop. I'd kept my mother's video on a special drive, and occasionally when I needed to hear her voice, I'd watch it again. Tonight felt like one of those times. Her face filled the screen, and I watched the entire 20-minute message hearing with new understanding what she'd been trying to tell me. It wasn't just about protecting property. It was about teaching me how to love myself enough to set boundaries, how to recognize that providing for others didn't mean sacrificing everything of my own, how to transform pain into protection for others instead of carrying it as permanent damage. After the video ended, I pulled out the leather journal Margaret had given me 2 years ago with the instruction to document everything. I'd filled 3 journals since then, chronicling not just the legal proceedings but my own transformation. Tonight I wrote about what I'd learned through all of this, that betrayal doesn't have to destroy you if you refuse to let it define you. That justice doesn't have to mean cruelty. It can mean consequences proportional to harm and opportunities for those willing to change. That setting boundaries isn't selfishness, but necessary self-love. That sometimes the best response to having something stolen from you is to give something freely to others, transforming theft into generosity. I wrote that I was happy. Not in the shallow way I'd once thought happiness meant the accumulation of success and the appearance of a perfect life, but in a deeper way that came from building something meaningful, from connecting authentically with others, from using my pain to prevent others' pain. I'd been broken, and in the rebuilding I'd become someone more whole than I'd ever been when I'd thought I was intact. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall early even for this elevation. Fat flakes drifted past the windows, illuminated by the light from inside the villa. I walked to the front door and stepped outside, letting the cold mountain air fill my lungs. The wooden plaque we'd installed beside the door yesterday gleamed in the porch light, its engraved letters clear and permanent. Silver Hope Villa, a sanctuary for women reclaiming their lives. I touched the plaque with one hand, feeling the carved letters under my fingertips. This place had been violated by people I'd trusted. It had been the site of my greatest betrayal. But it had also become the site of my transformation, the foundation for a community of survivors, and a literal sanctuary for women who needed safety while they rebuilt their lives. The snow fell harder now, accumulating on the deck railing and the branches of the aspens. I stood in the doorway between the warmth inside and the cold outside, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon 2 years ago, I felt completely at home at Betrayal. As the first snow began to fall on the mountain, I looked at the plaque we'd installed by the door. Silver Hope Villa, a sanctuary for women reclaiming their lives. And for the first time since that terrible afternoon 2 years ago, I felt completely at home. 2 years ago, I thought my world had ended when I walked into my villa and discovered the ultimate betrayal. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered: my marriage, my trust, my sanctuary. But standing here now, watching snow fall on a home that's become a refuge for dozens of women, I understand something profound. I didn't lose everything. I lost the illusion of what I thought I had, and in losing that illusion, I found something real. My sister is still in prison, working toward redemption that may or may not be genuine. My ex-husband is serving his sentence, facing consequences for patterns that stretched back 30 years. Derek Morrison will likely die behind bars. His legacy, not the millions he stole, but the community of survivors who refused to let his crimes define them. And me, I'm no longer the woman who measured her worth by professional achievements and the appearance of a perfect life. I'm someone who understands that real strength isn't about never breaking, it's about how you rebuild yourself after the breaking. If you've experienced betrayal by someone you trusted, whether it was a spouse, a family member, or a business partner, I want you to know this: it's not your fault. You weren't stupid or naive or careless. You were human. You trusted someone who weaponized that trust, and that says everything about them and nothing about you. The shame belongs to the people who betrayed you, not to you for believing them. And if you're in the middle of your own battle right now, fighting to reclaim what was stolen from you, keep going. Document everything. Build your support system. Set boundaries even when people tell you you're being unreasonable. Protect yourself legally. And remember that justice sometimes takes time, but it's worth fighting for. Silver hope. Villa stands today as proof that pain can be transformed into purpose. That betrayal doesn't have to mean destruction, and that sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful from the ashes of what was burned down. What happened to me wasn't fair. What happened to Linda, to Claire, to all 43 victims of Derek's network wasn't fair. But fairness isn't always guaranteed in this world. What we can control is how we respond, how we rebuild, and whether we use our pain to protect others or carry it as permanent damage. I chose protection. I chose community. I chose to transform my mother's gift into something that could shelter not just me, but any woman who needed it. And in making that choice, I found something I'd been searching for my entire adult life without knowing it. I found home. Not in a building or a piece of property, but in purpose, in connection, in the act of turning survival into service. That's my story. That's how I went from discovering the worst betrayal of my life to building something that matters more than any real estate deal I ever closed. Thank you for listening, and I hope my journey gives you courage for your own. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted? How did you rebuild your life afterward? What would you have done differently in my situation? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today to keep fighting. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or validation, or just reminded you that you're not alone, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We share stories of resilience, justice, and transformation here, and your subscription helps these stories reach other women who need to hear them. Also, if you know someone going through financial fraud or betrayal by a partner or family member, please share this video with them. Sometimes, just knowing that someone else survived and thrived can make all the difference. Thank you for being part of this community. Together, we're stronger than any betrayal. Together, we transform pain into power and survival into sanctuary. I'll see you in the next story.